Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're getting into dating drama. The situationships, the slow burns that turned out to be slow disasters. The people who seem completely normal until suddenly they absolutely weren't. Grab your blanket, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Up next is someone who thought they were finally in something real, only to discover the person they were dating had been running a parallel situation so elaborate it had its own separate social media presence. I matched with a guy named Jordan on a dating app about 14 months ago. His profile was low key, a few photos, a bio that was short and a little dry, in a way I found more appealing than to the over-curated ones. A job in graphic design that explained the aesthetic coherence of his photos. We talked for 3 weeks before meeting, which was longer than I usually go before suggesting something in person. But the conversation was good enough that I kept letting it extend. He was funny in a way that built slowly, the kind of funny that requires actually paying attention to what the other person is saying rather than just waiting for your turn. We met for coffee on a Saturday afternoon, and it went the way good first dates go when the conversation has already been established. Comfortable quickly, running long without either of us noticing until we looked up and the coffee shop had shifted from afternoon to early evening clientele around us. He walked me to the train, and we made plans before I got on it. I remember thinking, on the ride home, that this felt like the beginning of something rather than another thing that was going to conclude after 3 dates, for reasons neither person fully articulates. We dated for 4 months. Real dating, consistent, forward-moving, the kind where you're meeting friends and being introduced with enough specificity that the introduction implies a trajectory. He met two of my closest friends at a birthday dinner for one of them and handled it well, which is a specific kind of test that most people don't realize they're taking. I met three of his. We had the exclusivity conversation at month 2, and it was easy in the way those conversations are when both people have already been operating as though it's been decided. The thing that broke it open was so small it almost didn't register. I was at his apartment on a Sunday, and he stepped out to take a call, which was not unusual. He had a freelance client who called on weekends when deadlines were close. His laptop was open on the counter, and the screen was visible from where I was sitting, and what was on it was a dating app. Not a notification, not a relic from before we met. An active session, open to the Messages tab, with the preview of a conversation visible in the sidebar. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I got up and went to the window and looked at the street and thought about what I was going to do with what I had just seen. When Jordan came back inside, he read my face. He was perceptive, which was one of the things I'd liked about him. And that perceptiveness now worked against him because he couldn't play ignorant about what I was communicating, without also playing ignorant about being perceptive. He looked at the laptop and looked at me and said nothing for a moment. That was its own confession. I asked him directly if he was still active on the apps. He said he checked them occasionally, but wasn't actively pursuing anything. I asked him to define pursuing. He was vague in the way of someone buying time. I asked him to show me the conversation that had been open on the screen. He didn't show me. Instead, he told me something that he seemed to have been deciding whether to say for some time. That he had a profile on a different platform, under a slightly different version of his name, that he maintained specifically for situations where someone he was seeing might check the apps he'd used to meet them. The alternate profile was a decoy. If I searched for him on the app where we'd matched, I would have found him inactive, because the active version of him was somewhere else, with different photos and a different bio and several conversations that were apparently ongoing. I want to let that sit for a second. He had built a decoy profile, anticipating the possibility that someone he was dating might check whether he was still active, and had built it specifically to be found in place of the real one. This was not a spontaneous bad decision. This was premeditated infrastructure. I asked him how long the alternate profile had existed. He said about 2 years. I asked if this was the first relationship in which he had used it. He said no. I asked him to please be honest about what he'd been doing on the other platform while we were together, and he told me, with the specific defeated honesty of someone who has been caught too completely to manage the exit, that he had been on 2 dates with 2 different people and had been in ongoing conversation with several more. I asked him one more question, which was why, and his answer was the most honest thing he said in the entire conversation, which was that he had not been able to stop even though he had wanted to, that the compulsion to keep looking was something he was aware of and ashamed of, and had not been able to address before it produced exactly the situation he was now sitting in. He said he was sorry. He looked like a person who had known this was coming for months and had been hoping, each week, that the week would pass without it arriving. I left. Not dramatically. I got my things and I told him I hoped he figured it out, and I meant it without warmth. I did not respond to the messages he sent. Over the following week, I told my 2 friends who had met him what had happened, and they were appropriately appalled and appropriately present, which is what you need from people in that moment. What I've thought about most in the months since is the infrastructure, the decoy profile, the 2 years of it existing before me, running through whatever relationships had preceded ours, and the premeditation required to build something like that and maintain it is not the behavior of someone who made a mistake in a moment of weakness. It's the behavior of someone who understood what they were doing clearly enough to construct a system around doing it. That level of clarity about your own behavior, combined with the inability to change it, is its own particular kind of sadness, and I found, once the anger had its full run, that I felt something close to pity. Not enough to respond to the messages, but enough to stop needing him to be a villain rather than just someone who couldn't stop doing something they knew was wrong. Then that one lands in such a specific place because the decoy profile is the detail that changes everything, because it removes the possibility of reading this as weakness or passivity and makes it legible only as intention. You don't build a decoy without understanding what you're hiding and why. The perceptiveness that was one of the things she liked about him is what makes the ending simultaneously inevitable and specific. He couldn't perform ignorance because being perceptive was too baked into who he was, and it caught him in the exact moment when being perceptive about someone else's face was the thing that cost him everything. Sometimes the quality that draws you to someone is the same quality that makes it impossible for them to maintain the lie when the lie is finally visible. Even this next one is about someone who dated a person for 7 months and discovered, at the end of those 7 months, that almost nothing they'd been told about that person's life was accurate. I met Callie at a gallery opening, not through an app, in person, at an event, the way people occasionally still meet, which already felt like something. She was standing in front of a piece I'd been staring at for 5 minutes, trying to decide how I felt about it, and she said something about it that resolved my uncertainty immediately and led to 40 minutes of conversation that ended with us exchanging numbers rather than a formal goodbye. She said she was a photographer. She showed me her portfolio on her phone that night, and it was genuinely impressive. Distinctive aesthetic, technical skill that was visible even on a small screen, the kind of work that has a point of view rather than just competence. She said she did commercial work to pay the bills and personal projects for the rest. She said she had her own studio space in the neighborhood, rented with 2 other photographers. She said she'd had a long-term relationship and about a year ago, and she'd spent the year since focusing on work and herself, and was ready now for something that had real potential. Everything she said had the texture of truth. Not performed truth, just the ordinary truth of a person telling you who they are. I had no reason to examine it, and I didn't. We dated through the fall and into the winter. I visited what she called her studio twice, a shared creative space in an industrial building, messy and well lit and full of equipment. I met one friend, she called her closest one, a woman named Rosalind, who was warm and easy, and who seemed to know Callie well. I saw the photographs on her apartment walls that matched the portfolio she'd shown me. The life she'd presented had three-dimensional texture, details that appeared consistently, references that connected to each other, the kind of internal coherence that a fabricated life struggles to maintain. At month 7, I planned a trip. A long weekend, a city neither of us had been to, the kind of plan that implies something about where a relationship is going. Callie was excited and specific about it. The neighborhood she wanted to walk through, a restaurant she'd read about, a museum exhibition she'd been wanting to see. We booked the flights. I put it in my calendar. I told my friends I was going. 2 weeks before the trip, a woman named Daria messaged me on Instagram. Her message was brief and direct. She said she was Callie's girlfriend. She said they had been together for 2.5 years. She said she had found my profile through a tagged photo from the gallery where Callie and I had met, and had been trying to decide what to do with what she found for 3 months. She included a photograph of herself and Callie together that had been taken 6 weeks earlier. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Callie and Daria were at a dinner table at what appeared to be a birthday gathering. Other people visible in the background. The easy body language of two people who have been together long enough that their closeness is unconscious. Callie looked exactly like herself. Comfortable, known, at home in a life I had not known existed. I called Callie, but she picked up on the second ring, which was itself information. She didn't know yet that Daria had reached out. I told her Daria had messaged me, and I waited through the silence that followed. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer to every question I might have had about whether the relationship with Daria was real. What came out over the following conversation was that most of what Callie had told me was true. The photography was real. The studio was real. Rosalind was real. The long-term relationship she described as ending a year ago had not ended. It had continued alongside our entire relationship, with enough compartmentalization that the two sides had apparently not intersected until Daria found the tagged photo. I asked Callie why she had been looking for something new if she had a relationship she was maintaining. She said the relationship with Daria had been difficult for the past year, and she had been considering ending it, and she had let the situation develop beyond the point where that was a clean explanation because she hadn't been able to make the decision she needed to make. I asked her if she had considered that the decision was not only hers to make. She said she understood that now. The quality of what she said was genuinely remorseful, and also 2 weeks before a trip I had booked flights for, and I held both of those things at the same time. I canceled the trip. I messaged Daria back and told her I had not known, and that I was sorry she'd had to find me. She responded that she believed me, and thanked me, and said she was figuring out what she was doing about her own situation, which I respected and didn't pry into. Callie sent a message 3 weeks later that was long and carefully written, and genuine in its accounting of what she had done and why. I read it once and did not respond. Not from anger exactly, more from the understanding that there was nothing the message could give me that I hadn't already given myself, and that responding would extend something that had already been extended past its natural end. The gallery we met at has a new exhibition. I walked past it last month and thought about the piece we'd both been looking at and the thing she said that resolved my uncertainty about it. The thing she said was still true. That's the part that's strange to hold. That the conversation was real, even if the life around it was more complicated than I was told. Sometimes a person can be genuinely themselves in one moment and entirely managed in the next. And the genuine moments don't cancel the managed ones. They just make them harder to account for. And that's where that one ends. The detail about Daria finding the tagged photo after 3 months of deciding what to do with it is the piece that reframes the entire story. because Callie had been living with the possibility of this for at least 3 months and had kept booking trips anyway, which is the specific behavior of someone who has decided at each decision point that the cost of honesty is still higher than the cost of continuation. The thing the narrator holds at the end, that the genuine moments don't cancel the managed ones, is the most honest sentence in the whole story, and the one that resists the cleaner emotional resolution, because the cleaner resolution would require pretending the genuine moments weren't real, and they were. Here's one from someone who spent 8 months falling for a person they'd never met in person and discovered that the reason they'd never met was more specific than they'd been led to believe. I want to be clear up front that I was not naive about what I was doing. I am 41 years old. I have been on the internet long enough to know the landscape of online connection and its hazards. I was not a vulnerable person who had never navigated digital relationships. I say this not defensively, but because I think it matters for understanding how sophisticated the situation was. It was not designed for someone careless. It was designed for someone careful. I connected with a man named Patrick through a writing forum I've been part of for years, not a dating context. A community organized around a shared interest in literary fiction, where people post work and comment on each other's, and have been doing so long enough that real relationships develop through the texture of years of exchange. Patrick had been a peripheral presence in the community before he began commenting on my work, specifically about 18 months before anything personal developed. His comments were perceptive and specific, and showed real engagement with what I was writing rather than the generic positive feedback that fills those spaces. I began commenting on his work. A direct message exchange started. It deepened over months into something that was genuinely one of the better conversations I'd had about literature and writing in years. The personal layer developed slowly and in a way that felt organic to the context. We talked about our lives through the lens of what we were reading and writing, which is how writers often talk about their lives. He was a high school English teacher in a small city in the Pacific Northwest. He had been married and wasn't anymore. He had a daughter who was 11 and who he talked about with the specific and unguarded warmth of someone for whom parenting is not a performance. He sent photographs, not many, and not the kind people curate for impression, but the ordinary kind. His daughter at a soccer game, his kitchen in the morning, the view from a trail he'd hiked. At month 4, we began talking about meeting. He was 3 states away, and the logistics required planning. But neither of us treated the distance as an obstacle so much as a timing question. We scheduled a weekend twice, and both times it fell through. Once because his daughter got sick, and the weekend was not one he could leave. Once because a school situation required his presence in a way he apologized for at length. I did not read either cancellation as avoidance. Children get sick. School situations arise. At month 6, I suggested I come to him rather than coordinating a neutral location. He was enthusiastic about this, and we made specific plans. The neighborhood he'd show me, a bookstore he loved, dinner at a place he said was genuinely worth going to. I bought a plane ticket. Flexible fare, not expensive, but bought. 3 weeks before I was scheduled to arrive, Patrick told me something he should have told me earlier. He was still married. He and his wife were separated in the functional sense. They lived in the same house in separate arrangements. Shared parenting were in the process of the legal separation that would eventually become a divorce. But the situation was not concluded in the way he had allowed me to understand. It was concluded. The reason we had not met in person was that meeting in person would have required him to navigate logistics around the living situation that he had not been ready to navigate or explain. He said he should have told me from the beginning, and that he hadn't, because the beginning was when the connection was still just connection and hadn't felt like something that required full disclosure. He said it had become something that required full disclosure, some time ago, and that he had kept not finding the moment and had now run out of moments. He said he understood if I needed to cancel the trip. I canceled the trip. I want to be honest that the decision was not immediate. I sat with what he'd told me for 2 days because the connection was real, and I didn't want to dismiss it in an instant in a way that failed to honor what it had been. At the end of 2 days, I understood that what I couldn't move past was not the separated but still married itself. That situation is real and complicated, and I have enough life experience to know that endings are rarely as clean as their official status suggests. What I couldn't move past was the plane ticket, the specific choice to let me buy a plane ticket toward a meeting he knew I was flying into, with incomplete information. That was the decision that told me something about how he handled the moment when honesty was about to become expensive. I did not buy another plane ticket. We talked for another 2 weeks with the kind of tenderness of something being set down carefully. And then we stopped talking, and the form continues to exist, and we are both still peripherally in it, in the way of people who have chosen not to acknowledge each other directly. His writing is still good. I still see his comments on other people's work, and they are still the kind that show he's actually read what he's responding to. I try to read them the same way I read anyone's, and mostly I succeed. There it is. The plane ticket is the moral hinge of the whole thing. Not because buying it without full information is a catastrophic harm, but because allowing it to be bought is a specific choice made by someone who knew what they were allowing and calculated that the cost of disclosure was higher than the cost of letting the ticket get purchased. The narrator's patience with themselves and sitting with the decision for 2 days, rather than reacting immediately, is exactly right. Honoring what was real without letting the reality of it override the information the disclosure had just provided. The form existing and both of them still being peripherally in it is such a specific and recognizable kind of aftermath. The online version of still passing someone on the same street you always used. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say about a connection that was real and also not what you thought it was is that it was both things fully, and that holding both doesn't resolve into a single clean feeling, and that you eventually learn to read their comments on other people's work without it costing you what it used to cost. Moving on to someone who thought the person they were seeing was refreshingly straightforward, and discovered that the straightforwardness had been a very specific kind of performance. I have a preference for directness in the people I date. This is something I developed over years of relationships with people who communicated sideways and required significant emotional labor to decode, and it is a preference, I am aware, is partly a reaction to previous experiences rather than a purely abstract value. I know this about myself. I think knowing it makes me a reasonably self-aware doubter rather than someone running blindly from a wound, which is why Marcus appealed to me immediately. He said what he thought. He said it without the hedging and the qualifications and the careful positioning that I'd learned to recognize as the architecture around something someone didn't want to say directly. On our second date, he told me he was interested in something serious and wasn't interested in ambiguity. On our third, he told me something he found genuinely irritating about a comment I'd made on our first date. Not cruelly, but clearly, and then said he was telling me because he'd rather we knew each other honestly than comfortably. I found this genuinely refreshing. I told him so. We were together for 6 months, and the directness continued, in ways that made the relationship feel more solid than most. Conflict was addressed when it arose, rather than managed through avoidance, and feelings were stated rather than performed through behavior, and hoped to be read correctly. I had the experience, for the first time in a relationship, of never having to wonder what he was thinking, because he simply told me. What I found out over the course of month 6 was that the directness was selective, in a way I hadn't understood. Marcus was direct about everything except the things that would have required him to change a decision he'd already made. He was direct about his opinions. He was direct about his preferences. He was direct about my behaviors and their effect on him. He was not direct about the things he was doing that he knew I would have an opinion about. I found out about the first thing through a friend who had run into Marcus at an event I had not known he was attending. A party thrown by an ex, which is not in itself a problem, but which Marcus had not mentioned despite knowing I was aware of the history, and would have had questions. When I raised it, he said he hadn't mentioned it because he knew I'd react, and he hadn't wanted to deal with the reaction. I told him that managing my potential reaction by withholding information was not directness. It was the exact thing he told me he wasn't doing. He said that was a fair point and apologized. I accepted the apology because the incident itself was minor and because I believed the apology was genuine. But I had seen the seam in the directness and I could not unsee it. I started paying attention to the specific category of things Marcus was direct about versus the category he was managing quietly, and the distinction I found was precise. He was direct about everything that didn't require him to navigate my reaction to something he had chosen. He was not direct about his choices when those choices were things he decided were worth having, regardless of how I'd feel about them. The second thing was more significant. Marcus had been in contact with someone I knew he had complicated feelings about, a woman from a previous relationship that he had described as unresolved when we first talked about history. The contact had been ongoing for 3 months of our relationship. Not romantic or not provably so, but regular, private, and specifically not mentioned in the context of a relationship with someone who had aced him directly in month 1, whether there was anyone he had unfinished business with. He had said no. He had said it directly and without hesitation, which was the specific irony of the whole thing. The directness was most convincing in the moments when it was most convenient, which is the exact way dishonesty uses the reputation of honesty as cover. I ended things. I told him specifically why, and I told him that the specific pain of it was not what he'd done in any individual instance, but what the pattern revealed about how his directness worked. That it was a principle he applied to the things that were costless to apply it to, and suspended for the things where the cost was real. He said he understood. He said the critique was accurate. He said it in the direct way that was genuine and that I had always liked. And I found that I could simultaneously believe it and not find it sufficient, which is its own particular kind of ending. And that's that. The specific irony named at the end is the sentence that carries the whole story. Directness used as cover for the exact behavior, directness is supposed to prevent, and most convincing in the moments when it was most convenient. Which is the tell. The narrator's self-awareness about their own preference for directness, being partly a reaction to previous experiences, is the kind of honest self-examination that makes this story more than a complaint. It's someone who knows their own history well enough to account for it, and still got caught by something more sophisticated than their accounting had prepared them for. Sometimes the most effective performance of a quality is the one that's real in every area, except the one where performance matters most. This one comes from someone who dated a person for 5 months before discovering that the version of themselves their partner had fallen for had been assembled almost entirely from someone else's life. I matched with a woman named Serena in early spring, and the thing that made her profile stand out was specific and small. She had listed a book in her favorites that almost nobody has read, a translated novel from the 70s that I had spent a week with the previous year and thought about regularly afterward. I sent my opening message about the book, and we talked about nothing else for 3 days. By the end of the 3 days, I had told her things about that book that I had not told anyone because I hadn't found anyone to tell. We met, and the conversation continued in person with the same quality. She was sharp and specific, and had opinions that were genuinely her own, not calibrated to be agreeable, not softened to avoid friction, just the actual opinions of someone who had thought about things and arrived somewhere. I found this rare enough to be worth paying close attention to. Month 1 became month 2, and then month 3, and the relationship had a texture I hadn't had in a long time. We read the same things and argued about them. We cooked together on Sunday evenings with the ease of two people who have decided to be comfortable together. I met her sister at a birthday dinner, and the sister looked at me the way people look when they've been told good things and are checking the telling against the reality. The unraveling started with a reference she made to a conversation we'd had that I could not place, a specific exchange about a short story writer whose work we'd apparently discussed at length. She quoted something I'd supposedly said about the writer's use of silence, and I had no memory of saying it. I assumed the memory gap was mine and let it pass. Then it happened again. A second reference to a conversation I had no memory of, involving a film director whose work I knew, but had not particularly strong feelings about. Serena described my opinion of his early period with specificity and confidence, and the opinion she described did not match anything I believed. I asked her where she was recalling that from. She said our conversation in month 1. I did not pursue it at the dinner table. I thought about it afterward. I went back through the early messages I'd saved. I save early conversations the way some people save receipts. Not obsessively, just in case they become relevant later. What I found in the messages was a gap. We had talked at enormous length about the translated novel that had brought us together, and about a handful of other things, but the topics Serena was now attributing to our early conversations had not appeared in those messages. We had not had those conversations. I was almost certain of it, and then completely certain. I did something I felt strange about doing, which was look closely at Serena's social media for the first time. I had not looked before, because looking at someone's social media with investigative intent is something I find uncomfortable, and I had not had a reason to be investigative. I had a reason now. Her accounts were not large. She was not someone who posted constantly. But in the years of posts that were accessible, I found something that took me a few passes to fully understand. The readings she posted about, the films she referenced, the opinions she expressed publicly, they shifted. Not in the way that people's tastes naturally evolve, but in the more specific way of someone who had adapted their presented interests to a context and then adapted them again when the context changed. Posts from 3 years ago reflected a different set of enthusiasms than posts from 18 months ago, which reflected a different set than what she'd been discussing with me. I found the account of the person she'd been dating 3 years ago. Publicly visible, easy to locate. His interests were legible in his posts, and they matched the version of Serena that existed in her posts from the same period, and the pattern held for 18 months ago too. I thought about the translated novel in her profile. I thought about the 3 days of conversation it had produced. I asked her about it in person. I did not present all of my evidence. I asked her how she had come to read the novel, what had led her to it. Her answer was specific and detailed, and had the texture of a real memory. But one detail in it was verifiable, and when I looked it up later, I found that the detail was wrong in the specific way that suggests a constructed memory rather than a real one. The edition she described did not exist in the year she said she read it. I did not end things immediately. I sat with what I had and what it suggested, and I tried to be honest with myself about the range of explanations available. At the most charitable end was the possibility that Serena had a complicated relationship with her own interests, that she had spent years adapting herself to partners and had genuinely absorbed some of what she adapted and couldn't fully separate what was hers from what she'd borrowed. At the less charitable end was the possibility that the profile had been constructed to match whoever engaged with it, and the constructed version had then been maintained through our months together. I talked to her. She cried before I had fully explained what I'd found, which was itself information. You don't cry about a misunderstanding before it's been explained. You cry about something you've been waiting to be caught in. What came out was closer to the charitable explanation than the other, but not entirely, as she had been doing a version of this for years. She called it mirroring and said a therapist had named it for her, and that she was working on it. She said the feelings were real, even when the context around them wasn't entirely real. She said she had talked herself into believing she had read the novel because she had talked about it so much that the talking had started to feel like memory. I ended things, not because the feelings weren't real on her side, I believed they were, but because I had spent 5 months having a relationship with a version of a person that was partly assembled from what I was looking for, and I did not know how to separate what was genuinely hers from what she had shaped in my direction, and I was not able to do the work of finding out. She sent me a list of books she had actually read, unprompted, 2 weeks later. It was a short list, and it was clearly real in its specificity and its inclusion of some things I would not have predicted. I found it genuinely moving, and I found that the moving quality of it did not change anything I decided. That's the full picture. The crying before the explanation is the detail that does the most work, not as proof, but as the specific body language of someone who has been expecting a door to open and feels it opening before they see the handle turn. The list of real books sent, unprompted 2 weeks later, is the most heartbreaking detail in the whole thing, because it's the genuine version of herself, offered after the constructed version had already cost her everything, and the narrator being moved by it without being changed by it is exactly the right response. Acknowledging the realness without pretending. The realness retroactively stabilizes what came before. Sometimes people construct a self for the people they want to be loved by, because they don't trust the real one will be enough. And the cruelest part of that is that you never get to tell them whether it would have been. Next up is someone who dated a person for 10 months and then found out on an ordinary Wednesday that their relationship had been the subject of a bet. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like a plot from a late 90s romantic comedy in which the reveal happens at prom and the protagonists reconcile anyway after a chase through the rain. What I'm telling you is that this happened to me at 34, not at prom, and I did not reconcile. His name was Ben. We met at a mutual friends gathering, my friend Olive's birthday, a dinner party of maybe 12 people, the kind of evening where the seating is intentional, and you wonder afterward whether you've been arranged. Ben was seated across from me and was funny in the specific way that requires an audience to be paying attention, not performing for the table, but noticing things and saying the true version of them quietly enough that only the people closest to him caught it. I was one of the people closest to him. We talked until the dinner party had become Olive and her partner, and 2 people who had forgotten to leave. The relationship developed the way good relationships do, when both people are old enough to know what they want and honest enough to say it. We were clear with each other early, and it did not produce the speed bumps that clarity sometimes produces when one person is ready and the other isn't. We met each other's people. We talked about the future in the specific way that implies you both believe there is one. 10 months in, I would have said, with confidence, that I was in the best relationship of my adult life. The Wednesday it ended began as a Wednesday. I was at work. I received a message from a woman named Claire, who I did not know, and who explained, with more care than I would have managed in her position, that she was Ben's ex-girlfriend from before we met, and that she needed to tell me something that she'd been deciding about for 2 months. She told me that before Ben and I had started dating, and he and a group of his friends had been at a bar, and a conversation had turned into a challenge. The challenge, as she understood it from a friend of Ben's, who had told her recently, and from whom she had heard it with enough specificity to believe it, was that Ben would ask out the first woman who walked in after a certain point in the evening. The woman who walked in was Olive's friend who was meeting Olive there that night. That friend was me. I want to be precise about what Claire told me, because I do not want to distort it. She did not say it was a bet in the financial sense. She did not say the friends expected anything in particular from it, or that it had any stakes beyond the challenge itself. She said the initial approach, the asking for my number that night, had come from a dare-adjacent conversation, rather than a genuine impulse. She said she did not know what had developed after that initial contact, and she was not claiming it had all been manufactured. She was telling me what she knew about how it started. I did not call Ben from work. I waited until I was home, and I made tea, and I sat down, and I called him, and I told him what Claire had told me. Ben did not deny it. He said it had started that way, and that it had become something real, and that the origin had nothing to do with what the 10 months had been. He said he understood why I was calling, and what I was probably feeling, and he was sorry I'd found out the way I found out, rather than from him. I noted that there was a version of events in which I found out from him, which had not occurred, and he acknowledged that the version existed, and that he had not chosen it. I asked him when he had understood it was becoming something real. He said month 1. I asked him why he hadn't told me at month 1 or month 2, or at any point in the 10 months during which he'd apparently known the origin story of our relationship, while I hadn't. He said he had been afraid, not of my reaction specifically, but of the conversation, of having to explain something that had become irrelevant to him, and that he hadn't known how to contextualize without it sounding worse than it was. I told him that the contextualizing was exactly the thing I needed him to do, and that the avoidance of the conversation had made it impossible for me to decide for myself whether the origin was relevant. The decision about what was relevant to me had been made by him on my behalf, without my knowledge, and I did not accept that. We did not get back together. Olive felt terrible, which she shouldn't have. She hadn't known. Claire and I exchanged a few more messages, and I thanked her for telling me, even though the thanking felt complicated, because the gratitude existed alongside the wish that the thing she'd told me hadn't been true. Ben sent messages for about 3 weeks and it then stopped, which was the right call, even if it came later than it should have. What I think about when I think about that relationship now is not the Wednesday. It's the Thursday before, the ordinary day that came before the thing that changed the shape of everything before it. On that Thursday, I would have told you my relationship was exactly what it appeared to be, without any unexamined origins built from a genuine impulse toward another person. That Thursday is gone, but it was real while it was happening, and I find that I can't decide whether the realness of it matters, or whether it's exactly the kind of thing you tell yourself to make an ending survivable. There it is. The distinction between a bet and a dare-adjacent challenge is the specific precision that makes this narrator credible. They are not inflating the harm. They are reporting it exactly, which is harder to do with something painful than dramatizing it would be. The moment that lands with the most weight is Ben saying he'd understood it was real from month 1, and then the 10 months of knowing that followed. That's not a person who forgot to say something. That's a person who made a decision at each successive point that the disclosure was more costly than the continuation, and who made it 10 months in a row. The last paragraph about the Thursday before is the most quietly devastating thing in the story. The ordinary day that existed fully, and then stopped existing the way it had been, and the impossibility of deciding whether the reality of it before the change means anything after the change. Sometimes the cruelest thing about learning a truth is not the truth itself, but what it does to the days that came before it. The next one is from someone who fell for a person online and flew across the country to meet them, and discovered on arrival that almost nothing had been as described, but not in the direction they'd expected. I had been talking to a man named Leo for 3 months through a dating app that caters to people with specific interests in common. The interest we shared was hiking, not as a casual hobby, but as the kind of thing that organizes significant portions of your life and your calendar and your physical conditioning. His profile was full of trail photos, summit shots, the specific equipment choices of someone who takes this seriously, rather than someone who went on one good hike and decided to make it a personality. We talked at length about specific trails. He had done things I had not done, and I had done things he had not done. And the conversations about the overlap were genuinely good in the way that niche enthusiasm produces good conversation between the right people. He mentioned the Pacific Crest Trail in a context that suggested he had completed a section of it. He mentioned elevation gains that corresponded to specific places I recognized. He was specific in the way that people who have actually done things are specific. We also talked, as conversations extend, about our lives generally. He was a landscape architect, which suited the hiking somehow. He had a dog named Fern. He lived in Colorado and had for 8 years, after growing up on the East Coast. Why, he described his apartment as minimally furnished in the way of someone whose relationship to possessions has been edited by years of carrying everything you need in a pack. After 3 months of this, I flew to Denver. Not on an impulse, we had discussed it. We had video called several times. I had a reasonable picture of who I was flying to meet, and I had been doing this long enough to know how to assess risk. The flight was a few hours. I had a hotel for 3 nights. The plan was to meet, hike, and see what the in-person version of 3 months of conversation produced. Leo met me at the agreed location, which was a trailhead about 40 minutes from the city. He looked like his photos into the specific way that good photos look, like you without being flattering. Same face, approximately same build, clearly the same person, that we embraced with the slightly awkward warmth of people who know each other well in one medium and are now calibrating in another. We started hiking. Within the first half mile, I understood something was different. Not about Leo, about the hiking. The pace he set was a recovery pace. The gear he was wearing was newer than it should have been for someone with his described experience, with the specific shininess of things recently purchased. His breathing at a grade that I found comfortable was not the breathing of someone who hikes regularly at altitude. I did not say anything on the trail. I paid attention. By mile 2, I was confident that Leo was not the hiker he had presented himself as. Not dangerously so. He was fit and managing, just clearly not experienced at this level. The specificity of our trail conversations, I was now understanding, had been the specificity of someone who had researched thoroughly, rather than the specificity of someone who had been there. We finished the hike and got food, and I asked him over lunch how often he got out on trails. He was quiet for a moment, and then said something that was clearly the beginning of a truth he'd been holding. He said he had been hiking for about a year. He said before that he had been sedentary, in a way he wasn't proud of, and hiking had become part of a significant lifestyle change, and he was genuinely passionate about it. But the experience he'd implied in his profile was experience he was working toward, rather than experience he had. He said he had been afraid that if he presented himself accurately, he wouldn't have matched with me. He said the landscape architecture was real. Fern was real. Colorado and the 8 years and the minimally furnished apartment were all real. The hiking experience had been the thing he had overstated, because it was the thing the app had been organized around, and he had needed it to be enough to get to a conversation. I sat with this over lunch, and I found my feelings about it more complicated than I would have predicted. The discovery that someone had presented themselves differently than they were had a different quality than usual, because the direction of the misrepresentation was toward a better version of an aspiration rather than a concealed negative. He had not hidden something bad. He had borrowed the credentials of something he genuinely wanted to become. We spent the rest of the 3 days actually hiking at his level, which was moderate and fine and occasionally beautiful, and talking with the honesty that the disclosure had made available in a way the performance couldn't have. That in person, Leo was warmer than the constructed version, and more genuinely funny, and more interesting on the subjects he actually knew, rather than the one he'd performed. I liked him considerably more than I'd liked the profile. I flew home without a defined next step, and we tried the long-distance version of something for 2 months, before the logistics of it became the actual obstacle. We ended things without drama, with mutual respect, and with what I'd describe as genuine warmth. The hiking misrepresentation was not the reason it ended. The distance was the reason it ended. He texts on significant hiking occasions, when he summits something new, which he does now with increasing regularity. I respond, "It is one of the cleaner things in my recent history, and it came from the least clean beginning, which is its own instruction about how to hold unexpected complications." That's where that one lands. The specific detail of the gear being too new is the moment where the story turns. Because it's the kind of noticing that only someone who actually hikes would catch, and the narrator catching it in the first half mile is the story confirming its own credibility. The complication of Leo's misrepresentation being toward aspiration rather than concealment is the thing that makes this story resist the standard shape. The question of whether overstating a thing you genuinely want to become is the same category of dishonesty as hiding something you know is disqualifying doesn't have a clean answer, and the narrator doesn't pretend it does. The texted summit updates are the right ending image. The thing that was built on a false credential, eventually becoming the real credential, confirmed in small dispatches, offered to the person who saw through the original version and liked the actual one better. Sometimes the most honest version of yourself is the one you were pretending to already be, and sometimes the pretending is what gets you to the trail. This one is from someone who had a relationship end and believed it had ended mutually, then ran into their ex 2 years later and discovered in a single conversation that the ending had been the result of something they were never told. 2 years ago, I ended a relationship with a man named Elliot after 8 months of dating. And I say I ended it, but the honest version is that it ended in the mutual way that things end when two people have both arrived at the same place at different speeds. He had arrived there first, and I arrived a few weeks later, and the conversation we had was more of an acknowledgement than a decision. We said the things that people say when something is concluding honestly. We said we had cared about each other. We said the timing wasn't right. We said we wished each other well, and I believe we both meant it. I carried the relationship as a good but not right thing. Not a painful ending, not a complicated chapter. Just something that had run its natural course and concluded cleanly. I thought about Elliot occasionally with the warmth you have for people who were good to you, in a period that needed someone good. But 2 years later, I was at a bar with friends, and Elliot was there. We saw each other across the room, and there was a moment of the specific social calculation that ex-adjacent encounters require. And then we both apparently decided the calculation resolved in favor of saying hello. We spoke for about 20 minutes at the edge of the room, while our respective friends gave us the space people give when they understand what is being navigated. The conversation was easy in the way of people who liked each other and aren't carrying anything painful. At some point, it became retrospective in the way those conversations become when both people have enough distance to access them without defensiveness. He said something about the timing, echoing the thing we'd both said 2 years earlier, and I agreed. And then he said something that he seemed to assume I knew, a reference to a situation from that period that he spoke about as shared context. The situation he referenced was a conversation he had apparently had with a mutual friend of ours named Danny, around month 5 of our relationship, in which Danny had told Elliot something about my history that Elliot had found significant. He spoke about it in the way of something that had informed his decision to begin pulling back in the weeks before our ending. Not the cause of it, he said, but part of the landscape of why he'd started feeling uncertain. I asked him what Danny had told him. Elliot looked at me, and I watched him understand that I did not know what he was referencing. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, Danny had told him something about a previous relationship of mine, a characterization of how that relationship had ended, and what my role in the ending had been, that had raised concerns for Elliot about patterns he'd worried might repeat. What Danny had told Elliot was not accurate, not a complete fabrication. It had a seed of a real thing in it, but the characterization had been distorted in the direction of making me look significantly worse than the truth warranted. I knew this because I knew the truth of my own previous relationship, and I knew Danny had a partial and incorrect version of it that he had apparently delivered to my then boyfriend as though it were complete and certain. I stood there, processing this for a moment. That was probably longer than it appeared. Well, no, then I asked Elliot if what Danny had told him had affected the relationship. He said yes. He said he had not broken up with me over it. The ending had been real and mutual, into the way we'd both described it, but that it had produced a doubt in him that he'd carried from month 5 onward, and that had colored the last 3 months, of something that might have had more in it, if the doubt hadn't been there. I did not call Danny that night. I went home and sat with the specific shape of what I'd learned, which was not that my relationship with Elliot had been stolen. It had ended for real reasons, and I believed that. What had been affected was the quality of its last 3 months. The doubt that Danny had planted in month 5 had been present in the room for the rest of it, and I hadn't known the doubt was there. I hadn't known to address it. I'd simply experienced those months as slightly harder to read than the ones before, without understanding the source of the difficulty. I talked to Danny. He confirmed he'd said something to Elliot. His explanation was that he had been concerned about Elliot and had wanted to give him relevant context. I asked him why the context he'd given had included things that weren't accurate. He said he had shared his understanding of the situation and had not realized his understanding was incomplete. I told him the incomplete understanding, delivered with the confidence of a complete one, had cost something that belonged to me and to Elliot, and not to him, and that the next time he decided to be concerned about a friend's relationship, the concern should travel toward the person in the relationship rather than away from them. The conversation with Elliot and the conversation with Danny did not restore anything. The 8 months were what they were, and the 2 years after them were what they were, and none of that is retrievable. What I took from it was a more specific understanding of Danny's friendship, the kind of friend who acts on concern without checking whether their concern is accurate, which is the most dangerous kind because the intention is good and the damage is real, and the gap between them never gets examined. Elliot and I exchanged numbers at the bar. We have not used them. I suspect we will not. But knowing what those last 3 months were carrying without my knowledge changes how I remember them. Not entirely, but around the edges, in the places where I'd felt something I couldn't name at the time, and can name now. And that's where that one ends. The 2 years of carrying a relationship as good but not right, and then learning that its last 3 months had been operating with a weight neither party had named, is such a specific and quietly devastating thing. Not a revelation that destroys the memory, but one that explains the texture of it, fills in the parts that had felt slightly off without being identifiable. Danny's confidence delivering an incomplete understanding is named correctly as the specific danger of well-intentioned interference. The intention insulates the person from examining whether their information is accurate enough to act on, and by the time the inaccuracy surfaces, the damage has been done in a space where it can't be fully assessed. The exchanged numbers that neither person will probably use is the right ending image, Not a door reopened, just an acknowledgement that the story had more in it than either of them knew, and that the knowing, even 2 years late, is worth something. The next story is from someone who spent 6 months in what they believed was a healthy and reciprocal relationship, and discovered at its end that they had been the subject of an extended social experiment they had never agreed to participate in. Neat on a date, Dorko. I want to be honest that the word experiment sounds more dramatic than it felt in the living of it. It was not clinical, nobody had a clipboard. But the more accurate word has not presented itself in the years since it ended. An experiment is what I keep returning to, so experiment is what I'll use. Her name was Priya. We matched on an app in October and were together through the following spring. She was a behavioral researcher, not a therapist, an academic researcher, and she worked at a university studying relationship formation and attachment patterns in people who dated primarily through apps. This was not a secret. She told me on our second date with the casual transparency of someone who has learned that disclosing their work early prevents a specific kind of misunderstanding later. I thought it was interesting. I asked good questions about it. I did not think about it again. The relationship was good, present and warm, and without the specific kinds of friction that I had come to expect as the baseline cost of closeness with another person. She listened into the full way, not the waiting way. She remembered things, not in a note-taking manner, just in the organic way of someone who pays genuine attention. She was curious about my inner life in a way that felt like interest rather than interrogation, and I responded to that curiosity by being more open than I usually was at this stage. Month 4 was when I began noticing things I could not quite name. Conversations that had a slight quality of being guided toward a destination, rather than wandering somewhere together. Questions that clustered around specific topics, my attachment style, my communication patterns in previous relationships, my responses to conflict and uncertainty, with a frequency that I registered without interpreting. She was a behavioral researcher. Curiosity about this material was consistent with who she was. I did not follow the noticing to its conclusion. The conclusion arrived from outside the relationship. A friend of mine who worked at the same university mentioned Priya's name in a context that was not romantic. A research context, a paper that was in late development, a study on app-based relationship formation that had been running for the past year. My friend mentioned it as interesting departmental news, not knowing that the name he'd said was the person I was dating. I looked up the study. It was publicly listed on the university's research portal with the abstract available. The study was examining authentic versus performed self-disclosure in the context of app-initiated relationships, and was tracking how subjects' openness and attachment behaviors evolved across the first 6 months of a relationship formed through a dating app. I looked at that abstract for a long time. I did not assume the worst version immediately. There was a version in which Priya was conducting legitimate research with proper ethical protocols, and our relationship was entirely separate from it. I needed to ask her before I decided what I was looking at. I asked her. I told her what I'd found, and I asked her directly whether our relationship had any connection to her research. She was quiet for long enough that I had my answer before she spoke, and then she said that our relationship had not been initiated as a research subject. She had matched with me genuinely, but that some of the conversations we'd had informed her ongoing work, and that she had been aware of this overlap and had not disclosed it. I asked her what informed me specifically. She said she had noticed patterns in how I communicated and had found them relevant to the research questions she was examining, and had paid attention to them with the researcher part of her brain while also being present with the relationship part of her brain. And she had not known how to separate those two things once the overlap had become apparent. I asked her if what I had shared with her in the context of trusting her as a partner had made its way into her professional work without my knowledge or consent. She said nothing she had used was identifiable. I said that was a different question than the one I'd asked. She acknowledged the distinction and said yes. I ended things that week, not explosively. She was not a malicious person, and I did not want to treat her as one. But I was clear about what the problem was, which was not that she was a researcher, and not that she was curious about the material of my inner life. The problem was that the context in which I had offered that material had been relationship context, not research context, and those are different kinds of consent. What I had given her was not mine to give to her work, and she had taken it anyway, with the specific quiet ease of someone who had decided the overlap was manageable without checking whether I agreed. She sent a long message afterward that I read carefully. It was honest about the ethical failure and specific in its accounting of what she had done and why. It showed the self-awareness of someone who is genuinely good at examining behavior, including her own. I respected it. I also thought that the self-awareness, however genuine, had been available to her throughout the 6 months and had not been sufficient to produce the disclosure that would have let me decide whether I was comfortable with the situation. That's what I kept returning to. Not the research, the disclosure that never came. The version of events where she tells me month 2 what the overlap looks like and asks whether I'm comfortable continuing with that awareness. That version of events was available and she did not choose it. She chose to manage the overlap privately and trust that it would not surface. And the only reason it surfaced was a colleague who mentioned a study title without knowing it had a name in it that I recognized. I am more careful now about what I share early in relationships. I dislike that this is the lesson because I valued the openness, and I believe openness is worth the risk it carries. But the specific risk that your openness will be received in a context different from the one you offered it in, without your knowledge, that risk requires some attention, and I'm paying it more now than I was before. That's where it lands. The distinction between identifiably used and used without consent is the sharpest and most important thing the narrator says. Because Priya's defense that nothing was identifiable is a data privacy argument, not a relationship argument, and the narrator refuses to let the category confusion stand. The version of events where the disclosure happens in month 2 is the haunting counterfactual here. Not because it would have guaranteed a different ending, but because it would have guaranteed an informed one, and the right to make an informed decision about your own participation in something is not a minor thing to have removed from you without notice. Sometimes the people who understand human behavior most thoroughly are the ones most capable of managing the distance between observing it and being accountable to it. Up next is someone who dated a person for 4 months and ended it, and then discovered 18 months later that the ending had been received as the beginning of something entirely different. I dated a man named Owen for 4 months in my early 30s and ended it clearly and kindly at the 4-month point, because the chemistry I had hoped would develop had not developed, and I believe we both deserved to be in relationships where that particular quality was not being waited for. He received the ending gracefully, thanked me for being direct, said he understood, said he wished me well. I left the conversation feeling like I had done a hard thing correctly. 18 months later, a friend forwarded me a screenshot without preamble. The screenshot was from a Reddit thread in a dating advice community. The post described a situation in specific enough detail. The city, the timeline, several particular details about our dates that only someone who had been on them would know. That I understood within 2 readings that the poster was Owen and the situation was us. The post was asking for advice on how to win back a woman who had ended things prematurely. It described me, without using my name, as someone who had made a decision out of fear rather than genuine incompatibility. It framed the 4 months in terms that suggested a relationship more significant and more mutual than what I had experienced. It described the ending as something the poster believed could be reversed if the right approach was taken, and it was soliciting recommendations for that approach from the thread. The post was not recent. It had been made 14 months earlier, 4 months after we had ended things. The thread had 97 responses. I read them with the specific quality of attention you bring to something you cannot look away from, even as looking is costing you something. The responses ranged from the gently redirecting to the actively encouraging. A significant portion of them had advised persistence in various forms. Several had outlined specific strategies for reinitiating contact in ways that would seem organic rather than deliberate. A few had suggested time-based approaches, waiting for specific intervals before reaching out, timed to particular occasions. I went through my messages from the previous 14 months. In that period, I had received from Owen a birthday message that I had attributed to the ordinary continuation of post-breakup warmth. A message when a musician we had both liked released new music. A comment on a public post I had made that I had received as friendly and unremarkable. A check-in during a period when something in the news had been distressing that I had attributed to basic human consideration. I had attributed all of them to ordinary decency. I had received each one in good faith. I was now looking at them in the context of a 14-month thread in which 97 strangers had contributed to a strategy I had been the subject of without my knowledge, and the ordinary decency was something else entirely. I did not reach out to Owen about it. This was a decision I made carefully, and which I still believe was right. What I wanted from a conversation with him was not available. I could not get back the neutrality with which I'd received his messages. I could not unknow what the messages had been part of, and the conversation would not have produced anything except the satisfaction of letting him know. I knew, which was not sufficient justification for reopening something I had closed. I updated my privacy settings in ways I should have updated them earlier. I thought about the boundary between someone holding feelings for an ex and acting on those feelings through a planned campaign, and about how the planning was the thing that changed the category, not the feelings which were his to have, but the deliberate construction of organic-seeming contact across 14 months, crowdsourced from a forum of strangers. The musician both of us had liked released another album recently. I listened to it, and it was good. I did not receive a message about it. Now, either he has moved on, or he has learned that I saw the thread, or the strategy had a timeline that has now elapsed. I find that I genuinely hope it's the first one. Not for my sake at this point, for his. Carrying something like that for 14 months and counting is its own weight, and I would not wish it on someone I once liked well enough to try to end things with cleanly. There it is. The rereading of 14 months of ordinary seeming contact, in the context of a 97 response strategy thread, is the specific disorientation at the center of this story. Not each individual message, which was benign in isolation, but the pattern of them assembled with the foreknowledge of the thread. While the narrator's decision not to reach out to Owen is examined honestly rather than presented as obviously correct, they acknowledge what they wanted from the conversation, assess whether the conversation could provide it, and conclude it couldn't. That's the kind of reasoning that actually holds up versus the kind that's just avoidance dressed as principle. The last paragraph is the most generous thing in the story. The wish that it's the first option, that he moved on, and the reasoning behind it, which is not about her peace of mind, but about his. Sometimes the cleanest ending you can make with someone turns out to have been clean only from one direction. And the most honest thing you can do with that knowledge is decide not to unclean it further. Here's one from someone who discovered that the person they'd been dating had a fully operational second life, that they maintained with the same quality of presence they brought to the first one. I have thought carefully about how to explain what I mean by second life, because I want to be accurate. I do not mean an affair in the ordinary sense. I mean a second life, a second city, a second apartment, a second set of friends who knew him as the same person, with different coordinates, same name, same job, operated remotely, same personality, or close enough that the word same is the accurate one. Two complete contexts maintained in parallel with what seemed to be equivalent presence and investment. His name was Daniel. We were together for 11 months. He was based in the city where I lived and traveled frequently for work, which is something I had known from the beginning and which had never felt like a significant issue because the travel was explicable and consistent, and he was present when he was present in a way that made the absence during travel feel like weather rather than absence. The second context was in a city he traveled to regularly. Not a relationship exactly, or not one person. A life. A friend group he'd had for years. An apartment he'd sublet consistently enough to have a key and leave things there. A version of himself that was available to that city in ways my city version of him was not. He was not running a romantic parallel. He was running a life parallel, and within that second life, there were people who would have described him as present and invested in ways that matched how I would have described him in mine. I found out through the specific modern mechanism of a tagged photo. Someone in his second city posted a photo from a gathering and tagged him, and the account was public. And I was, for reasons that don't matter but that were innocent, looking at his profile. The photo showed him at a table with people I'd never heard him mention. At a gathering, he had told me he was skipping because he was tired and staying in. I did not react to the photo immediately. I sat with it, and I looked at his account with the specific attention of someone who now had a question they needed to answer. The account was not large and was not particularly active, but it contained enough. Other tagged photos, location-adjacent posts, references and comments, to confirm that the second city was not a work context. It was a life context. I asked him about it when he returned. Not confrontationally, genuinely, giving him the space to explain something I believed might have an explanation I hadn't considered. He was honest faster than I expected. He said he had spent years maintaining two contexts, because something about the containment of them worked for him in a way he understood was unusual. He said he was not deceiving either context about who he was. He was the same person in both places. He said the deception was the omission of one context from the other, and he understood that was its own significant thing. I asked him what he had told the other context about his life in my city. He said he had described himself as someone who traveled frequently and maintained connections in multiple places, which was technically true, and was the same framing he had offered me about the travel. He had been technically true in both directions simultaneously, and the technical truth had been sufficient to maintain two lives that each believed themselves to be his primary one. What I found when I sat with this, and I sat with it for a long time, was that the harm was harder to name than it felt. He had not lied about who he was. He had not fabricated feelings or manufactured connection. He had simply declined to tell me that the whole of his life was not available to me, which is a significant omission dressed in a very small package. I had believed I was with someone who was fully available in the direction of building something. The availability had a ceiling I hadn't known was there. I ended things. He accepted it without attempting to argue me out of it, which I found oddly respectful. The lack of argument was its own acknowledgement that he understood why the ceiling was a deal breaker rather than a negotiable condition. He sent one message 2 weeks later that said he had started talking to someone about the two cities thing and was trying to understand where it came from. I appreciated the update more than I expected to, and sent back 2 sentences that wished him well in that process and meant it. The second city exists somewhere. The people who knew him there knew a version of him that was real, and I do not begrudge them that version. I just know now that a version being real is not the same as a version being complete. And that completeness is one of the things I'm going to ask about more directly going forward. I mean, that's the full picture. The technical truth deployed in both directions simultaneously is the specific mechanism that makes Daniel's situation so difficult to prosecute as dishonesty in the ordinary sense. Every individual statement he made was accurate, and the architecture built from accurate statements was a structure built to support something he knew the accurate statements were concealing. The ceiling on availability being the deal breaker, rather than anything he did is named correctly as the issue. Not the second life as a character flaw, but the undisclosed limit on what was being offered. The one message he sent about talking to someone is the detail that makes the ending land with something other than pure disappointment. It suggests a person who knew the thing about themselves and was finally looking at it, which is the best available outcome of a situation like this one. Sometimes the most honest thing a relationship reveals is the limit of what the other person can offer, and the most useful thing you can take from it is knowing to ask about the limit next time before you've been inside it for 11 months. This one is from someone who had what they describe as the best 3 months of their dating life, and then found out those 3 months had been the conclusion of something rather than the beginning. Her name was Natasha, and she was newly out of a long relationship when we matched. She told me this on the first date without framing it as a warning or an apology. Just as context, the way people contextualize themselves when they're trying to be honest about where they are. I appreciated the honesty. I told her I understood that newly out could mean many things, and asked what it meant for her. She said she had done her grieving during the relationship's slow end, rather than after it, which happens, and that she was genuinely ready for something new and not using new to mean distraction. I believed her because the 3 months that followed were not the 3 months of someone using someone else as a distraction. They were present and forward-looking and had the specific quality of someone who knows what they want because they've spent significant time understanding what they don't. She was decided in ways that felt stable. She introduced me to her people. She made plans that extended past the immediate week. I began to believe, which is always the step that precedes the loss of believing. The ending came from her with an honesty that I respected, and that hurt in equal measure. She said she had realized, over the previous 2 weeks, that she was not as ready as she had believed herself to be. That something about the relationship becoming real and forward-moving had surfaced a grief she had thought was processed and turned out to be waiting. She said she was sorry, and that I had done nothing wrong, and that the timing was the problem and not me. I accepted this, not immediately. I sat with it for several days and came back to her with some questions because I needed to understand whether the timing explanation was the full explanation or whether it was the kind explanation covering something harder. She was patient with the questions and answered them specifically, and I came away believing the timing was real. What I found out 4 months later was that she had started dating someone within 3 weeks of ending things with me. The someone had been a friend, someone she had known before me, and who I had met once at a gathering during our 3 months, and who I had thought nothing of. The timeline made the grief surfacing explanation more complicated, not impossible. People process things in unexpected directions, and a known person can be a gentler re-entry than an unknown one, and I'm aware of all the ways this can be true. But complicated. I did not reach out to Natasha about it. The information came to me through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it without realizing it was information I didn't have, and I thanked them and processed it privately. I'm aware that I will never know the full version. Whether the other person was present throughout our 3 months in a way that was relevant, whether the grief was real, and the timing was genuinely as she described, whether I was a bridge or a chapter, or something that simply ran out of road. These are not questions I am going to get answered, and I have made my peace with the ambiguity, even as the ambiguity costs something. What I hold from the 3 months is what I always held, which is that they were genuinely good. The quality of them is not revised by the ending or by the 4-month discovery. I know this because I have checked. I have asked myself whether knowing what I know now makes the 3 months feel different, and the honest answer is that it makes the ending feel different, which is not the same thing. The 3 months were the 3 months. The ending was the ending. They do not have to be the same story. And that's that. The distinction at the close is the one that earns the whole story. The 3 months and the ending being held as separate stories, rather than letting the ending revise the 3 months retroactively. That's harder than it sounds, and most people don't manage it. Choosing instead to let the complicating discovery reach backward and reinterpret everything that came before. The narrator's refusal to do that is not denial. It's the specific discipline of holding things at their actual scale, rather than letting the last thing become the only thing. The ambiguity about whether the grief was real sits correctly as unresolvable. They name the ways it could be true, they acknowledge it's complicated, and they stop short of a verdict because the evidence doesn't support one. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do with an ending you don't fully understand is decide that not fully understanding it is not the same as the whole thing having been false. Moving on to someone who thought they had finally met a person who was exactly who they presented themselves to be, and discovered 6 months in that the presentation had been so carefully constructed, it had its own maintenance schedule. I am someone who has done enough dating to have developed a reasonably calibrated detector for performance. The person who agrees with everything you say. The person whose interests shift to match yours in real time. The person whose past relationships all ended because their exes were unreasonable, and whose self-portrait contains no unflattering angles. I've learned to notice these things, and I've learned to trust the noticing, which is part of why Marcus confused me for so long. There was nothing to notice. He was consistent in the way that genuine people are consistent. His opinions held across contexts. His stories matched when they overlapped. His interest in me had the specific texture of someone who likes a particular person, rather than someone performing the liking of a person in general. He had opinions I disagreed with, and he held them without immediately softening them when I pushed back. He had flaws he mentioned without being prompted, not as a performance of self-awareness, but in the ordinary way people mention things about themselves that they've accepted. He felt real in every way I knew how to test for real. At month 3, I met his closest friend, a man named Theo, who had known Marcus for over a decade. Theo was warm and easy, and spoke about Marcus with the specific, unguarded warmth of someone who has genuine history with a person rather than the promotional warmth of someone doing a social job. I asked Theo questions about Marcus the way you do when you're trying to complete a picture you only have from one direction, and Theo's answers were consistent with the Marcus I knew. I left that evening feeling more settled than I had before it. Month 5 was when things began to feel slightly off in a way I could not locate. Adam, not dramatically, nothing changed on the surface. But there was a quality that entered some of our conversations that I could not name. A slight calibration in how Marcus was responding to me that had not been there before. The opinions were the same, the consistency was the same. But something in the texture of his presence was different in a way I noticed, without being able to justify the noticing. I mentioned it to him, not as an accusation, but as an observation, offered directly because we had established directness as the register of our communication. He said he had been under pressure at work, and it was probably bleeding into how he was showing up. This was a plausible explanation, and I accepted it and watched to see whether the texture changed. It didn't change. It settled into its new, slightly off configuration, and I stopped expecting it to shift. Month 6. I found out what had happened in month 5. A woman Marcus had dated before me, her name was Simone. She reached out through a mutual acquaintance. had been in contact with Marcus starting at the 5-month mark of our relationship. Not romantic contact, or not only, but regular. The kind of regular that has a scheduling quality to it, rather than the irregular rhythm of people who are simply still friendly. Simone was not reaching out to cause damage. She seemed, from the conversation we had, like someone who was uncomfortable sitting with what she knew, and who had decided that telling me was the right thing regardless of the cost to herself. She told me that she and Marcus had a pattern. They had ended their relationship, reconnected when it seemed like he was in something new, and the reconnection had served a specific purpose that she described as him recalibrating against a familiar point when the new relationship became real enough to be frightening. She said he had done this with the relationship before hers as well. She knew this because the woman before her had told her, in a conversation similar to the one she was now having with me. I thought about the texture change in month 5. I thought about what happens in a relationship at month 5 when it has been going well, and the reality of where it's heading becomes visible. I thought about what recalibrating against a familiar point might produce in a person. The slight withdrawal, the adjusted presence, the imperceptible quality of someone managing an interior that they weren't sharing. I talked to Marcus. I told him what Simone had told me, and I told him I was not asking him to explain the contact with Simone, because the contact was not the issue. The issue was what the contact represented. The pattern Simone had described, the specific timing of it, the question of whether what I had noticed in month 5 was a work pressure bleed, or a person quietly managing something I had not been told was happening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the pattern Simone had described was real. He said he was aware of it and had been working on it and had believed this time was different, and then month 5 had arrived, and the belief had wobbled, and he had done what he had always done, rather than telling me that it was wobbling. He said he was sorry. He said the sorry in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something they know they should have said, and are relieved and wretched in equal measure to have finally said it. I did not end things immediately. I want to be honest about that because the immediate ending is the cleaner story. And what actually happened was more complicated. I stayed in it for 3 more weeks, not from confusion about what I'd learned, but from the genuine question of whether a pattern someone is aware of and actively working on is different from a pattern someone is running without that awareness. I concluded that it was different, but that the difference was not sufficient to change what I needed, which was a partner who told me when the wobble was happening, rather than managing the wobble through channels I wasn't part of. I ended it at 9 months. Marcus has since sent 2 messages, several months apart, that have had the quality of someone checking in, rather than someone asking for anything specific. I have responded briefly to each one. Not from ambivalence about the ending, but from the genuine recognition that he was not a bad person who did bad things. He was a person who had a specific fear response and managed it in a way that cost someone who deserved to be told what was happening. Those are different categories, and I try to keep them separate. That's where it lands. The recalibration pattern described by Simone is the thing that gives the texture change in month 5 its retroactive name. And the narrator noticed the texture change, raised it, received an explanation, and accepted it, which is exactly what a reasonable person does, and which was insufficient because the explanation was incomplete. Marcus being aware of the pattern and working on it, and then doing it anyway, is the most human detail in the story. The gap between self-knowledge and self-governance is real, and it produces real harm, even without requiring malicious intent. The 3 weeks of staying after the disclosure is named honestly rather than elided, which is what makes this narrator credible. They didn't react, they thought, and then they acted. Sometimes a person can be fully aware of their own worst pattern, and still unable to choose differently in the moment the pattern is called for. And sometimes loving someone is not the same as being able to be what they need. This one comes from someone who spent 8 months believing they were in an exclusive relationship and discovered they were in what their partner privately called a situationship, a word the narrator had never agreed to. I want to start with the conversation we had in month 2 because it is the center of everything. We had been dating for 2 months and things were going well, and I initiated a conversation about exclusivity because I am someone who prefers clarity over assumption. The conversation happened over dinner on a Tuesday. I said I was not seeing anyone else and wanted to know whether we were in agreement about the direction we were heading. His name was Ryan, said yes. He said he was not seeing anyone else either, and that he was in this with intention, and that the direction felt clear to him. I held on to that conversation, not anxiously. I was not someone who needed constant reassurance. I held onto it the way you hold onto a conversation that established something, a foundation you can build on without having to keep repouring it. For the 6 months after that conversation, I operated as someone in a defined relationship because I had a conversation that defined it. 8 months in, I was at a dinner party at which Ryan was not present and at which a friend of a friend made a reference to Ryan in a context that assumed I understood something I did not understand. The assumption was that I was aware of Ryan's general romantic situation, which the friend of a friend described with the casual confidence of someone relaying known information as a situationship he'd been in for most of the year. I went home from the dinner party, and I thought about the Tuesday in month 2 with the care of someone trying to hear a recording they made a long time ago. I was certain of what had been said. I was certain because I had come prepared for that conversation and had left it with what I believed was a clear answer. I asked Ryan directly the following day. I told him what I had heard, and I asked him to tell me how he understood our relationship. He was quiet in a way that told me, before he spoke, that his understanding was different from mine. Then he said he had thought of us as a serious dating situation that had not yet crossed into a defined relationship, and that he had assumed we were on the same page about the distinction. I asked him about the Tuesday. I asked him what he had meant when he said he was in at this with intention, and the direction felt clear. He said he had meant those things sincerely, and had not meant them to constitute an exclusivity agreement in the formal sense. I asked him what he had understood me to be asking when I asked whether we were in agreement about the direction we were heading. He said he had understood me to be asking whether he was invested, not whether he was exclusive. I sat with this for a moment. Then I asked him whether he had been seeing other people in the 6 months since that conversation. He said occasionally, not regularly, and not with anyone significant, and not as the primary focus of his romantic energy, but yes, the specific quality of what I was feeling in that moment was not anger exactly. It was more like the disorientation of someone who has been standing on what they believed was solid ground, and has just learned it was something more provisional. The conversation we had in month 2 was a real conversation that had happened. The words that were said in it were the words I remembered. The distance between what I had understood and what he had understood was not a matter of one of us being wrong about the facts. It was a matter of 2 people using the same conversation to confirm 2 different things, and only one of us had known that was happening. I told him that whatever his private understanding of the situation had been, he had received a question about exclusivity in month 2, and had not answered it in a way that communicated his actual position. He said he could see how his response had been ambiguous. I told him ambiguous was a generous characterization of a response to a direct question about exclusivity that he now said he had not understood as a question about exclusivity. He acknowledged that and did not try to argue further. I ended things, not with drama, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent 8 months investing in something and is now doing the accounting of that investment against a corrected picture of what it was. The accounting was not a comfortable process. What I have taken from it, beyond the obvious lesson about follow-up questions and written confirmation, is something about how people use ambiguity as a resource. Ryan had not lied to me. Every specific claim he made was defensible. He had simply maintained an interpretation of our situation that served him while allowing my interpretation to run alongside it without correction, because the correction would have cost him something he didn't want to give up. The ambiguity was not an accident. It was a space he had cultivated and maintained and lived in very comfortably for 8 months. I have had the exclusivity conversation differently in every relationship since. Not more anxiously, just more specifically. I ask what the words mean to the person I'm asking them to. It adds 2 minutes to a conversation, and it has not made anything less romantic. It has, however, made everything more clear, which turns out to be the thing I was actually looking for when I was looking for romantic. There it is, the two people using the same conversation to confirm two different things, and only one of them, knowing that was happening, is the exact mechanism of the harm. Not a lie, not a fabrication, just the strategic maintenance of an ambiguity that served one party, while the other was making decisions as though the ambiguity had been resolved. Ryan's willingness to acknowledge at the end that ambiguous was a generous characterization is the most honest thing he says, and arrives too late to repair anything but does at least confirm that the narrator's reading was correct. The practical revision at the end, asking what words mean to the specific person you're asking them to, is the right lesson extracted without bitterness. The kind of thing you learn from a specific experience that makes you better at navigating the next one without making you worse at being open in it. Here's one from someone who discovered on a second date that the person sitting across from them was living an entirely different timeline than the one they had presented on the first. The first date had been excellent. I want to establish this clearly because the excellence of the first date is part of what makes the second one interesting. We had talked for 4 hours at a bar that closed around us, and then continued the conversation on a walk that went 45 minutes past both of our trains. His name was James, and he was warm and specific and funny, in the exact register I find funny. Not performing for an audience, just noticing things and saying them. He had a job he was passionate about, friends he talked about with genuine affection, an apartment he'd been fixing up for 2 years, with a quality of domestic investment I found appealing. He kissed me at the train, and it was good, and I took my train home thinking about the second date before I'd arrived home from the first. The second date was 1 week later. Same bar, his suggestion, comfortable in the way that a second date at a familiar location can be comfortable when the first date was good. We ordered and settled, and I asked him how the week had been. What followed was a recounting of his week that contained a reference I did not recognize from the first date. He mentioned a roommate, not in passing, in the specific way of someone describing their living situation as a given, and the assumed shared context of two people who know each other's basic circumstances. His roommate had done something frustrating related to a shared kitchen, he said, and I looked at him and said, I hadn't known he had a roommate. He looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that they have said something they did not intend to say, and is now calculating very quickly. Then he said his living situation had changed recently. I asked when recently meant. He said a few months ago. I asked what his living situation was before a few months ago. He had been living with a girlfriend. Not a girlfriend from long ago, a girlfriend from 3 months ago. They had been together for 2 years and had lived together for one of those 2 years, and the relationship had ended 3 months before our first date. He had not mentioned any of this on the first date because, he said, it was recent enough that he had not known how to bring it up without it becoming the primary subject of the first date, which he had not wanted. I sat with this. The not mentioning of a 2-year live-in relationship that had ended 3 months earlier is not, by itself, an obvious ethical violation. People get to decide what they share and when, and first dates do not require complete personal history disclosure. But the way it had come out, accidentally, through a roommate reference, because he had lost track of which version of his circumstances he had presented to whom, suggested that the omission had been less about timing and more about management. He had not decided not to mention it tonight. He had decided not to mention it, and then lost track of the fact that tonight was still in the not yet mentioned window. I asked him whether he was over the relationship. He said yes, and I believed him, and then asked myself whether I believed him because it was true or because the first date had been excellent and I wanted it to be true. I concluded that I could not tell the difference and that the inability to tell the difference was itself relevant information. I asked him whether there was anything else about his current life that was different from what I might have understood from our first date. He considered this question with genuine seriousness, which I appreciated, and said he thought the roommate and the context around the roommate was the main thing. Then he said there was one other thing, which was that he had a dog he had not mentioned because the dog was currently staying with his ex. Because the living situation change had not yet resolved the question of where the dog was going to be permanently. The dog with the ex as an unresolved question struck me as a more significant detail than the roommate, not because of the dog itself, but because of what it represented. An active, unresolved thread with a person from a 2-year relationship that had ended 3 months ago. The dog was a reason for ongoing contact and ongoing negotiation, and I was 3 months behind all of that and only learning about it because of a kitchen complaint. We finished the date. It was less excellent than the first one, but it was honest in a way the first one had not been, which I found I preferred, even though the preferring was uncomfortable. He walked me to the train again, and this time did not kiss me, which was the right call, and said he understood if the things he'd told me changed where I was. They changed where I was. Not entirely. I went on 2 more dates with James because the person from the first date was still present and still worth knowing. But the 2 more dates did not recover the specific ease of the first one. And after the 4th date, we had a conversation that concluded things by mutual recognition rather than by decision. He said he thought he had come into this too soon. And I said I thought so too. And we were both right. The dog went to live with James permanently 3 months after we ended things. I know this because he sent a photo. Just a photo, no message, on just the dog in what was clearly the fixed-up apartment. And I looked at it for a moment and then sent back a thumbs up and meant it without complication. The dog was a good dog. The apartment looked better than I had imagined it. And that's that. The losing track of which version of his circumstances he had presented to whom is the specific tell. It is the accounting error of someone managing information rather than simply living his life. Because people who are simply living their lives do not lose track of whether they have mentioned a 2-year live-in relationship. The dog as the more significant detail, then the roommate is the narrator reading correctly in real time. It's not the romantic history that matters. It's the active, unresolved thread, the reason for ongoing contact that he is 3 months invested in before the person across from him even knows it exists. The photo of the dog sent with no message is the right ending to this one. Not an attempt to reopen anything, just a small transmission of a thing resolving that had been unresolved, offered to someone who had known it was unresolved and had decided what to do with that knowledge. Sometimes the cleanest thing an almost relationship leaves behind it is the occasional wordless update on the thing that was into the way of it. Next up is someone who fell in love with a person who turned out to be running the most elaborate and sustained long game that the narrator had ever encountered, and who ended up genuinely uncertain whether the long game had also contained genuine feeling, and who has decided to hold that uncertainty rather than resolve it in either direction. I need to give you some timeline context before I give you the story, because without the timeline, The story sounds like something that doesn't happen to real people, and I need you to understand that it happened to me. I met a woman named Claire at a conference in my industry 3 years ago. We spoke for 20 minutes at a reception and exchanged cards in the way that people exchange cards at industry events without any romantic intent on my part, and I believed hers. We connected on LinkedIn. We exchanged occasional professional messages over the following year, industry articles, a question she had about something in my area of expertise, a comment on a paper I'd written. The contact was professional and sparse, and I thought nothing of it beyond mild collegial warmth. 1 year after the conference, Claire messaged me to say she would be in my city for a work trip and would I like to get coffee. I said yes. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became a long walk. At the end of the walk, she said she had wanted to reach out for personal reasons for some time and had used the professional channels as a way of maintaining contact while she worked up the courage. I found this both charming and flattering, and I said something that communicated both. We began dating. The relationship moved with a quality of intention that I found unusual and appealing. She was clear about what she wanted and specific about why she wanted it with me, and the clarity did not feel like pressure. It felt like someone who had thought about what they were doing and was choosing it deliberately. 11 months in, I was using the word love and meaning it, and she was using it back. At month 14, a woman from Claire's past contacted me. She was not an ex in the romantic sense. She was a former friend, someone who had known Claire well for several years, and who had ended the friendship, she said, when she understood something about how Claire operated that she could not reconcile with continuing the friendship. She told me what she knew. She said she was not telling me to cause damage, but because she would have wanted someone to tell her. What she told me was that Claire had a pattern of identifying people she wanted to be in relationship with, and then conducting what this woman called pre-campaigns, sustained periods of low-level contact designed to establish familiarity and warmth before the direct approach, so that by the time the direct approach happened, the other person had a year of accumulated positive association, rather than the zero of a cold approach. She said Claire had done this with her own romantic relationships consistently, going back years. She said the professional channels were a common vehicle. She said the conference had not been random. Claire had known who I was before attending it. I asked Claire about this. I want to be clear that I did not simply accept what I had been told without giving Claire the opportunity to address it. The woman from Claire's past had her own reasons for telling me, and those reasons were not purely altruistic, and I tried to hold that while also taking the information seriously. I asked Claire to tell me how she had first become aware of me and when she had decided she wanted to know me. Claire was honest in a way I had not expected. She said she had known who I was before the conference. She had encountered my work, found it compelling, looked me up, and decided she wanted to meet me. She said she had chosen the conference because we would both be there, and it was a natural context. She said the professional messages afterward had been genuine in their content and had also served the purpose of keeping her in my peripheral awareness until she was ready to make a direct approach. She said she had not thought of it as a strategy so much as a patient approach to something she wanted that she had not known how to pursue more directly. I asked her whether the 14 months had been real. She said yes. She said the approach had been calculated and the feelings had been real, and she understood that the coexistence of those two things was something I would need to decide what to do with. I took 2 weeks. What I was deciding was not simple. The 14 months had been what they had been, real in every way I had experienced them. The origin of them was more deliberate than I had known, and the deliberateness had a quality that I found uncomfortable, without being able to identify it as clearly dishonest. She had wanted to meet me, and had found a way to meet me that involved a year of professional warmth. This was unusual and a little unsettling, and not obviously a moral violation in the way that more straightforward deceptions are violations. What I kept returning to was the conference being not random. I had believed we had met by chance in a room full of people, and the chance quality of it had been part of the story I held about us. The story was not false in its facts, but it was false in its texture, and the texture had mattered to me in a way I had not known until it was corrected. I ended the relationship. Not because the 14 months were not real, I believe they were, but because I had held a story about how we had found each other that had been allowed to persist without correction, and the correction arrived 14 months in from someone other than Claire, and that timing was Claire's choice. I could not reconcile the patience of the approach with the continued patience of the non-disclosure, and the second patience was the one that I could not make work. Claire accepted the ending with the same quality of deliberateness she brought to everything. She did not argue. She said she understood. She said she wished she had told me herself, and she said it without apparent expectation that the saying would change anything. She was right that it would not have changed anything, but it would have been mine to decide, and mine to decide it earlier. And the difference between deciding something yourself and having it decided by someone else's timeline is the whole thing. That's the whole thing. That's where that one ends. The distinction between a strategy and a patient approach is the one Claire draws, and the narrator declines to fully accept, because the distinction matters less than the fact that the non-disclosure ran 14 months after the approach had succeeded, and Claire had the information, and chose not to share it. The conference not being random is identified correctly as a texture issue, rather than a factual one. The facts of what happened were unchanged. The story of how they happened was different, and that story had mattered. The last 3 sentences are the most precisely distilled thing in the story. The difference between deciding something yourself and having it decided by someone else's timeline, and the naming of that difference as the whole thing, is exactly what it is. Sometimes the harm of a romantic long game is not what it built, but what it assumed. That the decision about when and whether to tell you was the other person's to make, and that you were a destination they were navigating toward, rather than a person they were navigating with. This one is from someone who dated a person for 7 months and discovered, through the most ordinary possible conversation, that their partner had been telling a fundamentally different story about their relationship to everyone in their life. My relationship with a woman named Isla began in January and was, by my accounting, one of the more honest things I had been inside in a long time. We talked about our histories early and without the usual protective vagueness. We talked about what had not worked in previous relationships with the specific self-awareness of 2 people who have done enough examining to name their own patterns, without flinching. She told me about a relationship that had ended badly, and I told her about one that had ended worse, and neither of us dressed it up. I found the lack of dressing up genuinely attractive. It suggested a person who had decided that the cost of honesty was lower than the cost of its absence and had organized their approach to relationships accordingly. 7 months in, I attended a birthday party for a mutual friend, at which several of Isla's people were also present. People I had met before, people who had met me before, the ordinary social overlap of 2 lives that have been combining for the better part of a year. The party was at a bar, and I arrived before Isla and was talking to one of her friends, a woman named Petra, who I had met twice and liked. When Petra said something that required me to stop and recalibrate what I thought I was standing in. Petra said something about Isla's last relationship, referring to it in the past tense, using a time frame that did not match any relationship Isla had described to me. I asked Petra to clarify the timeline. Petra looked at me with the expression of someone who has just understood they have said something they were not supposed to say, and is now trying to determine how much worse to make it by continuing. She continued. The relationship she was describing had ended, According to Petra, around 4 months ago. 4 months ago, I had been 2 months into what I believed was a relationship with Isla. I did not react visibly. I got another drink and I thought about what Petra had said and I applied it carefully against my own timeline. And the picture that assembled was one that I looked at very steadily for the rest of the party. Isla arrived 40 minutes after I did, and I watched her move through her people with the ease of someone who is comfortable in her social world. And I noted the ease, and I said nothing. I asked Isla about it 2 days later. I told her what Petra had said, and I told her the timeline I had assembled, and I asked her to tell me what the actual version was. She was quiet for a long time, and then she told me something that was harder in a different direction than I had expected. The relationship Petra had described had not been a parallel romantic situation in the way I had feared. It had been a relationship that Isla had not told her people was over. They had ended things, she and the other person, around the 2-month mark of her relationship with me, and she had told this person clearly, and had been clear in her own understanding that it was finished. What she had not done was tell her friends. For 4 months, while she and I had been building something, her social world had operated on the understanding that she was still in the previous relationship. She had deflected questions with vagueness. She had let the assumption run rather than correcting it. I asked her why. The why was the thing I could not assemble on my own. She said she had not been ready for her people to know she was in something new, because their knowing would have made it real in a way she had not been ready for. She said she had a history of her relationships becoming community property before they had solidified, and she had wanted to protect this one until she was certain it was going to hold. She said, by the time she was certain, the gap between the truth and what her people believed had become too wide to close, simply, and she had not known how to close it. I asked her what her friends currently thought we were. She said they thought we had met recently. They thought I was someone she had started seeing after her last relationship ended. The 7 months were, from her friend's perspective, a much shorter story. And the story was one in which the overlap I was now aware of did not appear, because the overlap required the parallel timelines to be visible, and she had kept the timelines separate. I tried to hold the specific shape of what had happened here. She had not deceived me about the relationship itself. The relationship she had described was real. Ended when she said it had ended. What she said it was while it was happening. What she had maintained was a fiction with her own people about the timeline. And the fiction had been maintained specifically to protect something she was building with me. The protection was real, and the method was a problem, and the two things coexisted in a way that did not simplify. I told her I needed some time, and I took a week. The week produced a conclusion that surprised me somewhat, which was that the thing I could not fully move past was not the fiction itself, but what maintaining the fiction had cost us. 7 months of a relationship that had been real for both of us had been conducted on her side, without the anchor that social acknowledgement provides. Her people had not known. Nobody in her life had witnessed the 7 months. And that invisibility had kept the relationship in a slightly provisional state that I had sometimes sensed without knowing what I was sensing, a quality of it not quite fully landing, of something remaining slightly in transit. I told her all of this. We had several long conversations about it in the following 2 weeks, and the conversations were the most honest we had ever had, which was its own kind of irony. The thing that broke open the honesty was a gap in the honesty, and what came out the other side was clearer than what had preceded it. We did not end things. I want to be honest about that, because the narrative shape of this kind of story usually ends in a particular place, and we did not end there. We are still together. It has been 7 months since the conversation with Petra, and the relationship has a quality now that it did not have before, more solid, more witnessed, more fully landed in both of our lives. Her people know me as someone she has been with for over a year now. which is the accurate version, and the telling of the accurate version was its own complicated conversation that she handled with more directness than she had managed before. I do not know whether we would have arrived at this quality without the Petra conversation. I suspect we would not have. The gap in the honesty was also a gap in the landing, and both needed to close before we could build on ground that would hold. We are building on it now, and most days, that is the whole story. That's the full picture. The specific harm of the parallel timelines is named correctly as what it cost rather than what it concealed. The relationship running in a slightly provisional state, without the witness of her social world, kept in transit when it needed to land. The narrator's week of processing that produces a conclusion that surprises them is the most honest structural move in the story. They expected to arrive at a particular ending and found something more complicated, and they report that without dressing it as wisdom or resolution. The 7 months since the conversation being better than the 7 months before, it is not presented as proof that everything was fine. It's presented as what actually happened, which is more useful than a verdict would be. Sometimes the thing that needed to be said was being avoided by both people in slightly different directions, and the collision of one person's carelessness with another person's fear is what finally says it. The next story is from someone who spent 3 months trying to understand why every date with the same person felt slightly like a job interview, and discovered the reason at the end of month 3 in a way that reframed the previous 12 weeks entirely. I have been on enough dates to know the difference between someone who is nervous and someone who is evaluating. Nervous people ask questions because silence is uncomfortable and they want the conversation to keep moving. Evaluating people ask questions with the specific quality of someone building a file. The questions are connected, they build on each other. They return to earlier answers in a way that suggests the earlier answers were recorded rather than simply heard. I know the difference, and I am describing it carefully because I want to be clear that what I experienced with a man named Felix was the second kind and not the first. He was pleasant. I want to say that because it's true, and because the pleasantness was part of what kept me in it for 3 months. He was warm and attentive and funny, in the occasional way that people are funny, when their primary mode is serious engagement rather than performance. But the attentiveness had a quality I kept noticing. He remembered things with the completeness of someone taking notes. He would return, weeks later, to something I had mentioned in passing on our first date, with a precision that exceeded ordinary good listening. The questions he asked were organized in a way that, in retrospect, had a logic I could not see at the time but can see now. I kept going on the dates because the evaluating quality, while noticeable, had a plausible alternative explanation. Some people are simply thorough and curious and present in a way that resembles evaluation without being it. I gave him the benefit of that explanation across 3 months, because the dates were otherwise good, and because I was aware of my own tendency to pattern match toward past experiences that had been evaluating in a less benign sense. At the end of month 3, Felix told me something he said he should have told me earlier. He worked in a field I'm not going to specify, but which involved significant professional risk if personal information became known in certain contexts. His romantic life was, for professional reasons, something he kept within a strict information boundary. He had been, and he was specific about this, to his credit, conducting a due diligence process across the first 3 months. He had looked up publicly available information about me. He had, he said carefully, he'd spoken with someone who knew me professionally to verify that I was who I presented myself as. He had been assessing whether I was someone whose discretion he could trust before he allowed the relationship to become something that would require trusting my discretion. I looked at him across the restaurant table for a long moment. He said he understood this was unusual. He said the professional context was genuine, and the risk was real, and the due diligence was something he had done in previous relationships and had found necessary. He said everything he had found had been positive, and that he was now, at the end of month 3, prepared to be fully open with me in ways he had not been able to be while the assessment was ongoing. He said this as though it were good news. I asked him what fully open meant, and given that we had been on 12 dates over 3 months, and I had believed myself to already be in a relationship with a person who was present and honest. He said the emotional openness had been real throughout. The informational openness was what had been partial. I asked him to be specific about what had been partial. He listed several things he had not disclosed about his professional life, and one thing he had not disclosed about his personal life, a living situation that was more complicated than he had described, because those things had been within the boundary until the assessment concluded. I thought about the 12 dates. I thought about what I had shared across those 12 dates, which was the ordinary accumulation of self-disclosure that happens when you believe you are building mutual intimacy, which I had believed I was building. The mutuality had been managed from his side in a way I had not consented to, and had not been told about. I had been offering myself in good faith to a process whose terms I had not been given the opportunity to accept or decline. I told him this. He said he understood and that he was sorry the process had produced that experience for me, and that the assessment itself had been about professional necessity rather than personal distrust. I said the framing of it as professional necessity did not change the fact that I had been in an assessment I did not know I was in, and that the reasonable thing to do when you need to conduct an assessment before you can be fully open with someone is to tell them that before the assessment begins, so that they can decide whether they accept those terms. He said he had not disclosed the assessment because disclosing it would have affected the assessment's validity. I said I understood the logic and found it insufficient as a justification for conducting an evaluation of a person across 3 months without their knowledge. We did not have more dates. He sent a message that was thoughtful and that acknowledged the specific harm more clearly than the restaurant conversation had. I read it carefully because I thought it deserved to be read carefully. And then I did not respond because there was nothing in it that opened a door I wanted to walk through. I think about the 12th date sometimes, the last one before the disclosure, the date on which he had apparently decided the assessment was complete and the relationship could begin. I had believed the relationship had already been going for 3 months. The gap between those two understandings is the whole story in one image. 2 people at a dinner table, one of them 3 months in and one of them at the beginning, and only one of them knowing that's the shape of things. And that's that. The disclosure of the assessment as good news is the detail that tells you the most about Felix's understanding of what he had been doing. He had arrived at the conclusion of the process and was presenting the conclusion as the beginning of something, without apparent awareness that the person across from him had not been waiting for a process to conclude. The internal logic of not disclosing the assessment, because it would affect the assessment's validity, is real and is also the logic of a person who has decided their own need for information supersedes the other person's right to know what kind of interaction they are participating in. The last image, 2 people at a table, one 3 months in, and one at the beginning, is the cleanest distillation of the harm in the whole story. Sometimes the relationship you believed you were building turns out to have been the waiting room for the relationship the other person was deciding whether to begin. Here's one from someone who had an ending so clean and mutual that they held it as the model for how things can conclude with dignity, and then discovered 2 years later that the clean ending had been a performance staged for a specific audience. The audience was me. I was the audience. I dated a woman named Vivian for 9 months when I was 29. The 9 months were good in the specific way of a relationship between 2 people in their late 20s who know themselves well enough to choose each other deliberately and have chosen well. We were good together in the functional senses and the non-functional ones. The way you talk about books and the way you move around each other in a kitchen and the specific ease of sleeping next to someone who does not feel like a problem you are solving. At 9 months, the relationship ended because she was offered a position in another country and took it, which was the right decision for her, and which I supported without ambivalence because I understood what the opportunity was and what it would cost her to decline it. The ending conversation was the best I have ever had in that context. She was direct and warm and honest about what she felt, and what the decision cost her, and what she hoped for me, and I was the same in return. We said we would stay in contact, and we did, lightly and warmly for the first year. Then the contact thinned as contact does with time and distance, and I thought of her, with the specific, uncomplicated warmth you have for someone who was good to you, and for whom you were good in return. 2 years after the ending, I was at a dinner with a friend who had also known Vivian, and this friend said something in passing about Vivian's timeline that did not match the timeline I had been given. The friend was describing when Vivian had started at her new position. The start date was 3 months earlier than the date of our ending conversation. I asked the friend to repeat the date. She did. I sat with it and said nothing, and changed the subject, and went home and looked at my calendar. The ending conversation had happened in October. The position, according to my friend, had begun in July. Vivian had been working at the new position for 3 months before the conversation in which she told me she had accepted an offer and was leaving. I want to be specific about what I was reconstructing. She had accepted and begun a position 3 months before, telling me. The 9 months of our relationship, as I had understood them, ended in October. The actual 9 months of our relationship had therefore included 3 months, during which she knew she was leaving, and had not told me, followed by a conversation in which she presented the acceptance of the offer as the conclusion of the relationship, rather than an event that had occurred at the beginning of its final third. The 3 months were the problem, not the leaving. She had the right to take the position and the right to end the relationship in the context of taking it. The 3 months of knowing and not telling were the problem. The 9 months I had experienced included 3 months that she had been experiencing as something different. A concluded thing being maintained rather than a live thing being navigated. I had been in a live relationship for those 3 months. She had been in a different kind of thing. I reached out to Vivian. She was still in the other country, and we had not spoken in some time. And the reaching out required the specific effort of reopening a channel that had politely closed. I told her what I had found out, and I asked her to tell me the actual timeline. She did not deny it. She said she had accepted the offer and had needed time to figure out how to tell me. And the time had extended, and she had not known how to shorten it once it had gone as long as it had. I asked her what the 3 months had been for her. She said they had been genuinely difficult. She said she had cared about me and about the relationship, and leaving it had not been easy, and she had not wanted to end things before she had to. I said she had ended things 3 months before she told me she was ending them, which was a different kind of ending than the one I had been given. She said she understood that. I asked her why she had not told me immediately when she accepted. She said she had been afraid of how I would respond, and had wanted to get settled in the new place before navigating the ending. I thought about the 3 months of her being settled in the new place. While I was still in a relationship I believed was current. The protection she had been seeking had been purchased with 3 months of my time that I had not been given the opportunity to spend differently. I did not stay angry about it. I am not, at the distance I now have from this, particularly angry. What I held for some time was a revised version of the 9 months that required me to re-examine the final third with the new information. And the re-examination produced a set of small things that had been confusing at the time, and were no longer confusing. The slight quality of conclusion and how she was present in those months. The endings of evenings that had a specific tenderness I had taken for depth. and now understood as farewell. The October conversation that had been so clean and so well prepared. It was well prepared because it had been prepared for 3 months. The dignity of it was real, and was also the culmination of a process I had not known was happening. Both things were true, and I held both until the holding got easier, which took a while and then happened. That's where it lands. The recategorizing of those 3 months, from live relationship being navigated to concluded thing being maintained, is the precise harm, and the narrator names it without dramatizing it, which is the right register for something this quiet and this specific. The small, confusing things that are no longer confusing after the recategorization is the most recognizable detail for anyone who has ever had a relationship end and then received information that made the end make more sense than it did at the time. The 10-month conversation being well prepared because it had 3 months of preparation behind it reframes the thing they held as a model for dignified endings, not as false, but as more deliberate than they knew. Sometimes the most considered ending is the one that was given the most time to become considered, and sometimes that time was not yours to give. Me moving on to someone whose dating life produced one of the stranger discoveries of any story tonight. A realization that arrived not through confrontation or accident, but through a stranger at a bus stop and a photograph on a phone. I had been seeing a man named Leo for about 5 months. Leo was low-key in the way I tend to find appealing, not performing enthusiasm or intensity, just quietly present and interested and consistent in the way of someone who has decided something and is not looking for reasons to undecide it. He was a carpenter, which suited him in the way that some jobs suit people. He had a physical relationship to the world that extended to how he touched things and moved through spaces, and I found it appealing in ways I did not articulate to him because some things lose their quality when you articulate them. We were not living together. We saw each other 2 or 3 times a week in the way of people who have established a rhythm without having had a formal conversation about establishing a rhythm. His apartment was in a neighborhood 20 minutes from mine, and I knew it well enough to move through it in the dark, and he knew mine equally well, and the mutual knowing of each other's spaces had a domesticity that neither of us had named. On a Tuesday in November, I was waiting for a bus in his neighborhood. I had left his apartment that morning and missed my usual bus, and was waiting at the stop, reading something on my phone, when a woman sat down next to me. She was perhaps 60, well-dressed in the practical way of someone who is comfortable rather than stylish. And she glanced at my phone screen, and then looked away, and then looked back. And then she asked me if I knew the man in my phone's lock screen photo. The lock screen photo was one I had taken of Leo 4 months earlier. He was laughing at something I no longer remembered, caught in the specific unguarded way of someone who does not know they are being photographed. I said yes, he was my boyfriend. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read. Then she said that she was his landlord. Then she said that she had thought he lived alone. I said he did live alone. She said she had seen a woman coming and going from his apartment regularly for at least the past year. She described the woman with enough specificity, dark hair, a particular coat, a habit of arriving in the early mornings, that I could tell she was describing a specific person and not a general impression. I was not that person in 2 of the 3 details. My hair at that point was not dark. I thanked her for the information and got on the bus when it came and sat in the back and thought about what I had just been told. I want to be honest that my first response was not clean anger. It was the specific suspended quality of someone who has received information they do not yet know what to do with, containing as it does both the possibility that it is what it appears to be and the possibility that there is an explanation that changes it. I tried to give the explanation possibility fair consideration. The landlord was elderly and might have been confused about timing or detail. The dark-haired woman might be a friend or a family member. The regularity of early morning visits had an explanation that did not require what I was already beginning to think. I held those possibilities for the length of the bus ride and found them insufficient by the time I got off. I told Leo I needed to come over and came over that evening, and I told him what had happened at the bus stop. I was specific. The landlord's description, the dark hair, the particular coat, the year of regular visits. Leo was quiet through all of it. The quiet was the specific quiet of someone who is deciding very quickly how much of what they know they're going to say. He said there was someone else. Not in the way that implied it was casual or recent, someone with a history and a regularity that matched what the landlord had described. He said it had been ongoing before me and had continued during me, and he had not known how to end either situation, and had consequently continued both. He said this in the flat tone of someone delivering a truth they are tired of carrying, rather than someone performing remorse. I asked him some specific questions because I needed specific answers, and he provided them. The other woman had been in his life for 14 months. She was in his life before me. She continued to be in his life for the 5 months I had believed I was the person in his life. He had not told her about me either, as far as he knew, and they were having a version of the same conversation right now, via text, which he had initiated when I had texted him on the bus that I was coming over. I want to note that I felt something almost like respect for that, the texting her simultaneously, rather than waiting to see how my conversation concluded before deciding what to say to her. It was a small honesty inside a large dishonesty, and I acknowledged it without letting it change anything. I left his apartment and did not return. He sent messages over the following week that I read and did not respond to. Not from cruelty, but from the genuine absence of anything I needed from him that a response could provide. The carpenter work that I had found appealing now existed in my memory, alongside what the apartment had been while I thought I knew it. And the knowing while not knowing had a quality I found I could not simply set down. I set it down eventually, in the way you set down things that are too heavy to carry permanently, but it took longer than I expected. The bus stop in his neighborhood exists. I have not been back to that neighborhood since, which requires a small routing adjustment, but is worth it for now. Maybe not forever. For now. There it is. The stranger at the bus stop being the mechanism is so specifically ordinary. Not an investigation, not a confrontation. Just a woman sitting down and recognizing a face on a lock screen and saying what she knew. And the specificity of what she knew. The dark hair and the particular coat and the year of visits is what keeps the moment from being dismissible. Leo texting the other woman simultaneously when he understood what was coming is the small honesty inside the large dishonesty, and the narrator naming it as such is the kind of precise accounting that makes this narrator credible. They are not collapsing everything about the person into the worst thing about them. They are looking at the whole picture and holding it accurately. The routing adjustment for the bus stop is the most human detail in the whole chunk. Not a dramatic rupture, just a small daily navigation around something that is still tender, offered without commentary on when or whether it will stop being necessary. Sometimes the smallest adjustments in your daily life are the most honest measure of what something cost you. This one is from someone who thought they were being chosen and found out, and at the worst possible moment, that they were being used as a benchmark. I met a woman named Audrey through friends at a gathering in late September, and the meeting had a quality of inevitability that I do not usually assign to things because I am skeptical of that framing. But she was the kind of person who fills a room without appearing to try, and I was the kind of person who notices when a room is being filled, and we found each other at the edge of the party in the way that certain people find each other at parties. Both slightly more comfortable at the edge than the center. Both more interested in one good conversation than the general warmth of a crowd. We talked for 2 hours and exchanged numbers at the end of the night, without either of us making it a production. The first month was the kind of first month that makes you revise your priors about what this process can feel like. She was present in the full sense, not just available, but actually there, in the conversation, in the moment, without the quality of partial attention that dating so often produces. In people who are managing multiple situations or protecting themselves from investment. I lowered my own protections accordingly, which I noted at the time as something I was doing and chose to do anyway. Month 2 and month 3 continued in the same register. We spent weekends together. I met 2 of her friends, and she met 3 of mine, and the introductions had the easy quality of something that felt established rather than provisional. I used the word girlfriend in a conversation with my own friend, and did not correct it afterward. The thing that broke it open arrived not from something she did, but from something I accidentally saw. Her phone was on the table between us at dinner, and a notification appeared on the screen from an app I recognized as a dating app. Not a message notification, an activity notification, the kind that tells you someone has liked your profile. I saw it for a second before the screen went dark. I did not say anything at dinner. I sat with what I had seen for 4 days. The 4 days produced 3 possible explanations I could live with, and one I could not. The ones I could live with involved old accounts and forgotten notifications, and the general debris of the digital romantic landscape. The one I could not live with was the obvious one, and by day 4, I could no longer maintain the others with sufficient conviction. I asked her. She was honest before I finished the question, which suggested she had been carrying the anticipation of the question for some time. She said she had maintained an active presence on the app throughout our 3 months. Not pursuing anything, she said. She was careful about that word. But maintaining visibility. Keeping options available in the background while she figured out whether what we had was what she wanted. I asked her to explain the distinction between pursuing and maintaining visibility. She said pursuing meant initiating contact and going on dates, which she had not done. I asked whether she had responded to messages. She said occasionally. I asked whether she had matched with people. She said yes. I asked her what we had been while she was doing this. She said we had been real, which I believed. And then she said something that landed differently than she appeared to intend it. She said she had needed a real thing to measure the other options against. I want to stay with that sentence because it is the center of the story. She had needed a real thing to measure the other options against. What I had believed was a relationship, a mutual, chosen, forward-moving thing, had also been functioning as a calibration instrument. The 3 months I had experienced as the 2 of us building something had also been 3 months of her using what we had built as a reference point for evaluating what else was available. I told her I understood what she had said, and I told her what it meant from where I was standing. That a relationship used as a benchmark for other options is not a relationship in the sense I had understood us to be in one. That the presence I had experienced from her, which was real and which I did not doubt, had been present in a context I had not been told about. A context in which I was simultaneously the thing she was choosing and the thing she was choosing against. Those 2 positions are not the same position, and occupying both of them without disclosing it was a form of having the relationship on terms I had not agreed to. She heard this. She did not argue with it. She said she had not thought of it in those terms, and she believed herself when she said it, and I believed her too, which was the specific complication of this story. She had not consciously constructed a benchmark. She had simply been unable to fully close the aperture of her options, and had not named what remaining open meant for the person on the other side of it. We ended things at dinner, and I took a cab home and looked out the window at the city going past and felt the specific quality of a loss that is not simple. Because the thing that was lost was also real. Not manufactured, not a misunderstanding of something false. It was real, and it was also other things at the same time. And both of those truths existed fully. I have not seen Audrey since. I think about the edge of that party sometimes, and the 2 hours of conversation and the revision of priors. The revision stands. What happened afterward does not undo the quality of what made me revise them. I try to hold that as a useful piece of information about what's possible rather than a painful piece of information about what was taken. And most days, the reframe holds. That's where it lands. The sentence she says accidentally, that she needed a real thing to measure the other options against, is the one that does the damage because it is not a confession. It is a description, offered with the casual quality of something the speaker did not fully understand they were revealing. The distinction between pursuing and maintaining visibility is examined correctly by the narrator as insufficient. The categories are drawn around her behavior rather than around its effect, which is the specific kind of accounting that serves the person doing the accounting and not the person being accounted for. The narrator holding the revision of priors as useful information, rather than as a wound, is the work of someone who has decided what to do with an experience that doesn't simplify. And the doing of it, rather than the arrival at it, is what the story is actually about. Sometimes you are genuinely chosen and also being compared simultaneously, and the two things feel different from opposite sides of the table. The next story is from someone who spent 4 months in a relationship and then spent the following year slowly realizing that the relationship had been rehearsed, that they had been dated in a specific order and with a specific script because the person they were with was working up the courage for someone else. I want to be careful here because I have spent significant time examining whether what I'm describing is what actually happened or whether it is the story I constructed to make sense of something that hurt. I have come down on the side of it being what actually happened. But I want the caveat to be visible because it seems honest to include it. His name was Finn, and we met at a concert in March. He was the friend of a friend, introduced at the merch table in the way of a casual introduction that neither party is expected to do anything with. We did something with it. He asked for my number and texted that same night, which is the move of someone who has decided rather than someone who is wondering. I like the decisiveness, and the 4 months were warm and present, and there was an ease to them that I found comfortable in the way of something fitting rather than something exciting. Not boring, the ease was the ease of things that work rather than the ease of low stakes. We were not in conflict. We were not in the charged difficulty of incompatible people, generating friction that reads as chemistry. We were simply good together in the quiet and reliable sense. When it ended at the 4-month mark, Finn said something that I stored as the explanation, and only began examining a year later. He said he had realized he was not able to give the relationship what it deserved. He said this with what appeared to be genuine difficulty and genuine care, and I received it that way. Not without pain, but without suspicion. And the year later, peace came from a conversation with the mutual friend who had introduced us. She mentioned, in the context of an unrelated conversation, that Finn was seeing someone, a woman he had apparently had feelings for long before I knew him, a woman who had been with someone else during the period he had been with me, who had become available a few months after Finn and I ended things. The mutual friend mentioned this as ordinary news, updating me on someone I had dated briefly once, without understanding the specific weight the information was carrying. I asked some questions. The answers assembled into a picture I sat with for a long time before deciding what to call it. Finn had feelings for this woman for over a year before she became available. During the period she was unavailable, he had dated. I was not the first, or not obviously the first, but I was one of the people he had dated during that period. The relationship with me had occurred in the window of her unavailability. It had ended when she became available, or around that time. He was now with her. The picture this assembled was one I tested against the alternative explanations before settling on it. The alternative was coincidence. He had feelings for someone, dated other people honestly. That person became available. He pursued her. The end. This is a version that does not require his relationship with me to have been a holding pattern, and I tried to hold it genuinely before concluding I could not. What I could not hold was the specific framing of the ending, that he was not able to give the relationship what it deserved. That framing suggested the limitation was internal, about his capacity, about something in him that prevented the full investment. It was not that framing. The limitation was directional. He was directing his investment elsewhere, had been for the whole 4 months, and the investment available for us was what remained after that direction had taken its share. I did not reach out to Finn. The year's distance made the reaching out feel like it would serve my need for acknowledgement more than any useful purpose, and I was not confident my need for acknowledgement was something he owed me to serve. I have not sought it from him. What I have done is recalibrate something about how I read ease. The ease of those 4 months I had read as two people who fit each other. I now think some portion of it was the ease of someone who was not fully present, who was pleasant and consistent and not difficult, because they were not fully invested, and the not fully invested quality had read as groundedness rather than as partial absence. I am paying more attention now to the specific texture of ease, whether it is the ease of fit or the ease of someone who is not entirely there. The difference is subtle, and I am still learning to read it. I think I am getting better, and that's that. The alternative explanation test the narrator runs before settling on their reading is the thing that earns the conclusion. They do not immediately assume the worst reading. They name the innocent version. They try to hold it. They explain specifically why they cannot. And that process is the difference between a fair account and a grievance narrative, and this is clearly the former. The reframing of ease at the end is the most practically useful thing in the story. Not a conclusion about Finn specifically, but an observation about a signal they had been reading as positive that can also be a signal of partial absence. And the narrator naming themselves as still learning to read it is the honest acknowledgement that the recalibration is ongoing rather than complete. Sometimes the most comfortable relationships are the ones where the other person is most at ease because they are least at stake. And the comfort that felt like safety was actually the warmth of someone sitting next to a fire they were only partly in. Here's one that starts with a first date and ends with the discovery, 6 months later, that the first date had never actually been a first date. What I mean is this. I met a man named Oliver at a wine bar in April. We had matched on an app and chosen the wine bar, and sat across from each other for 3 hours, on what I understood to be the first time two people who had spoken only through a screen were meeting in physical space. Oliver was charming and warm and self-deprecating in the specific way that suggests real self-awareness rather than performed humility. He asked questions that built on previous answers. He laughed in the unguarded way. By the end of the 3 hours, I was interested in the second date, and he made clear he was too. 6 months into what became a relationship, we were at a dinner with friends, and one of his friends, a man named Caspian, who I had met several times and liked, made a reference to the wine bar. Not in a significant way. He was describing it to someone who had not been there, recommending it, mentioning that Oliver and I had been there together. Then he said something that opened the floor in a way I don't think he anticipated. He said he remembered when Oliver had come back from the bar, having no idea the night had gone so well, given everything that had been going on at the time. The table continued talking. I stayed with what Caspian had said, and I turned it over, and I identified the part that did not fit, given everything that had been going on at the time. I did not know what had been going on at the time, other than the ordinary context of a first date. Oh, later that night, I asked Oliver what Caspian had meant. Oliver was quiet in the specific way that precedes something being said that has been not said for a while. Then he told me that our first date had occurred 10 days after the end of a significant relationship, a 3-year relationship, the most serious he had been in, which had ended when the other person had ended it. He said he had matched with me and made the date and gone on the date while he was still in the acute phase of that ending because he had needed to do something forward-facing, or he would have stayed in bed for a week. I asked him why he had not told me this. He said the date had gone so well that he had not wanted to complicate it with context that was no longer relevant by the end of the evening. I asked him when it became relevant enough to mention. He said he had kept waiting for a moment, and the moment had never presented as clearly as he needed it to. And then 6 months had passed, and the not mentioning had become its own thing to manage. I told him I understood the logic, and I did not think the logic was good enough. Not because the ending of a previous relationship 10 days before our first date was disqualifying. Things end, people move forward. The timing of a first date relative to a previous ending is not inherently a moral issue. What was a moral issue was the 6 months during which I had built a relationship with someone whose state at the starting point of it was different from what I had understood. I had believed I was meeting someone who was in ordinary circumstances for a first date. I had been one of the forward-facing things a person does after a significant loss, and I had not been told that. He said he was sorry, and the sorry was real, in a way I had learned to recognize from him. He said the first date had been genuinely good, and his feelings from it had been genuine, and he had not manufactured the interest to cover the grief, which I believed. The interest had been visible and consistent from the beginning. What he had manufactured was the context. The ordinary circumstances I had believed I was meeting him in had been something more acute and more specific, and he had allowed me to believe the ordinary version. We did not end things over this. I want to be accurate about that. We are still together. What changed was a conversation about disclosure and about what I needed from him going forward, in terms of telling me the things that were relevant to the context of our relationship, even when the telling was uncomfortable, even when the timing felt wrong. He said he could do that. So far, he has. What I hold about the first date is not the same as what I held before Caspian's comment. It is not worse, exactly. The date itself was what it was, and I can access the memory of it accurately. But it has a layer now, a piece of context underneath it that was always there and that I did not know was there. I have decided that the layer does not change the date so much as it completes it. The full picture of that evening includes who he was when he walked into the wine bar, and what it meant for him to have walked in anyway, and chosen to be present and genuine for 3 hours, in the acute aftermath of a significant ending. I find, when I look at it that way, that it is more rather than less. There it is. The forward-facing thing, detail, is the center of this one. Not a manipulation, not a deception designed to take something, but a survival move that was not disclosed, and that the narrator was owed the context to understand. The 6-month moment at which the not mentioning became its own thing to manage is the mechanism that most people will recognize from their own experience of any significant omission. The window in which the thing could have been said simply closes, and then the window in which it can be said with moderate difficulty closes. And then you're in the territory where saying it requires acknowledging the duration of the not saying, which is harder than the original thing would have been. The reframe at the end, that the full picture makes the first date more rather than less, is the generous and specific move of someone who has decided what to do with a complication, rather than letting the complication do something to them. Sometimes a person can be present and genuine at the beginning of something, while also being in a state they did not tell you about. And whether those two things add up to something that works is a question each person has to answer for themselves. And I'm moving on to someone who discovered mid-relationship that the version of their partner they had fallen for was a version their partner had designed specifically for the falling for phase and did not intend to maintain. She called it front-loading. She used that word herself eventually in the conversation that ended things, and I want to credit her with the precision of it, even as the precision was part of what made the conversation so difficult. Front-loading, the practice of putting your most appealing qualities forward in concentrated form during the early period of a relationship before you settle into your natural register. She had a theory about it. She had thought about it enough to have a vocabulary for it. And her name was Delphine, and I met her at a gallery event, and she was one of those people who is immediately interesting in a way that is also immediately slightly overwhelming. The kind of person you have to calibrate yourself to, who operates at a frequency that requires some adjustment before you can match it comfortably. I found the calibration process appealing rather than tiring. I told myself this was because she was worth it and not because I was performing the tolerance of intensity. The first 2 months were the most concentrated period of presence I had experienced in a relationship. She was available in a way that redefined my baseline for what available meant. Responsive, attentive, showing up with the kind of spontaneity that suggests a person whose primary interest is what is in front of them, rather than the management of multiple priorities. She read things I mentioned and brought them up later. She made plans that required effort and executed them without making the effort visible. She was the best version of a person who is trying to be in a relationship with you. At month 3, the concentration began to dilute, not suddenly, gradually, in the way of a tide rather than a wave. The responsiveness became more ordinary. The spontaneity appeared less frequently. The reading and referencing of things I had mentioned continued, but with less precision, suggesting attention that had become less total. I noticed these things, and I told myself they were the natural settling of a relationship, finding its sustainable register after the intensity of beginning. I told myself this through month 3 and month 4. By month 5, the settled register felt significantly less engaged than what I had come to understand as the baseline of our relationship, and I raised it with her in the way I raised things, directly and without making it larger than it was. The conversation that followed was not what I had expected. She did not deny the change. She said something that surprised me with its honesty, which was that the early months of a relationship were when she was most motivated to be her best self, and that the best self was a real version of her, not a fabrication, but was not the version she could maintain indefinitely. She said she had always found that relationships required a kind of launch energy she could not sustain, and that the settling I was noticing was the settling into what she was actually like, rather than what she was like when she was working hardest at something. I tried to understand what she was telling me. She was saying that the version I had experienced for the first 2 months was genuine, but concentrated, and that the concentration was something she produced at the beginning of relationships intentionally. Not to deceive, she said, but because the beginning required it, and she was someone who met the requirements of the beginning. The question was whether the person I had been calibrating to and had calibrated myself around was the person who was actually available. I asked her directly whether she thought the current version was the person I was going to be with. She said she thought so, yes. I asked her why she had not told me earlier. The early version was front-loaded, her word, which she introduced at this point in the conversation. She said she had not thought of it in those terms until recently, and that naming it felt like an admission she had not known how to make. I sat with what she had told me for 2 weeks. The 2 weeks produced something I did not fully expect, which was not resentment of the first 2 months, but a complicated grief about them. They had been real. The qualities I had experienced had been hers, but they had been produced in a concentration that was not sustainable, and I had organized my understanding of who she was around that concentration, and the organizing had been done without the information that the concentration was temporary. I had been calibrating to a frequency she was not going to maintain. I ended things, not because the settled version was insufficient in some absolute sense. She was a good person in her ordinary register too, interesting and warm and worth knowing. But I had spent 5 months with a particular understanding of who I was with, and the understanding had been based on a presentation that she herself now acknowledged had been assembled for the launch phase. I could not unanchor the expectation from what the first 2 months had established, and the expectation was not fair to hold against her, because she had not told me it was an expectation she could not meet. She accepted the ending with the specific composed quality she brought to most things. She said she understood. She said she was sorry she had not found the words earlier. I believed her on both counts. I still think about the front-loading theory, not because I hold it against her specifically, but because it named something that I had experienced before, without having a word for. The relationship that starts at a level it does not sustain, and the specific loss of having calibrated yourself to the level and then found yourself in a different place without being told the place was going to change. The word is useful. I wish I had needed it less. That's the full picture. And Delphine naming the thing herself with a precise vocabulary she had developed to describe her own behavior is the most uncomfortable kind of honesty. Uncomfortable because it is offered too late to prevent the harm, and with a clarity that suggests she had understood what she was doing while she was doing it, even if she had not named it in those terms. The grief about the first 2 months being real but concentrated is the specific emotional territory the story occupies. Not the grief of having been deceived by something false, but the grief of having been given something real in a form that could not last. The final sentence, and the word is useful, I wish I had needed it less, is the best ending this particular story could have. Mikshak, because it holds both things at the right scale without resolving them into a lesson that would be smaller than what was lost. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for yourself after a relationship that started better than it continued is simply keep the word you learned for what happened and hope the next time you recognize it early enough to ask. This one comes from someone who dated a person for 6 months, ended things cleanly, and then discovered that the clean ending had produced something in the other person that bore no relationship to what the ending had actually been. I ended things with a man named Tobias in the spring after 6 months that were decent without being remarkable. The decency was real. He was kind and present, and there was nothing wrong with him in any specific way. What there wasn't was the quality that makes decent feel like enough. And I made the decision to end it rather than wait for the absence of that quality to become the relationship's permanent condition. I told him this directly and with care. I said the things that were true, that I had valued the time, that he had done nothing wrong, that the limitation was about fit rather than fault. He received it with grace, and we said goodbye without drama at a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. I believed the Tuesday to be the conclusion. It was not the conclusion. What followed the Tuesday was a period of contact that began reasonably enough. A text a week after to say he was doing okay, which I received as thoughtful and responded to briefly. Then another text 2 weeks later about something we had talked about during the relationship, a reference to a shared interest that I received as the ordinary continuation of warmth between people who had been good to each other. I responded to that one too, because I am someone who believes that decency costs very little to maintain. The contact continued at intervals that were spaced just far enough apart to be individually receivable and collectively constituted something I did not fully examine until month 4 of the post-Tuesday period. By month 4, I had received 23 messages from Tobias, responded to 15 of them, and had not been asked on a date or presented with any direct statement of intent. The messages were pleasant and innocuous, and when I laid them out in sequence, they had the quality of a sustained effort disguised as casual contact. I told a friend about the messages and she asked me to count them. I counted them, 23, across 4 months. She asked me how I'd been receiving them. I said as friendly. She asked me if I thought they were friendly. I thought about it and said I thought they were something more purposeful than friendly that was using friendly as its delivery system. I was not comfortable with this framing because it required me to be less charitable than I had been, and I am someone who prefers charitable interpretations when they are available. I held the less charitable framing for a week and found that it held up to the holding and did not simplify back into something I could receive as ordinary. I sent Tobias a message. I told him I had valued the time we had spent together, and I had tried to honor that by responding to his messages with warmth. And that I wanted to be honest with him because I thought honesty was more respectful than continued warmth that might be implying something I was not intending to imply. I told him I was not open to revisiting the relationship and that I was saying so explicitly because I thought he deserved explicit rather than the management of his hope through my continued responses. He responded with a message that confirmed the less charitable framing. He said he had been hoping the contact would remind me of what we had and that the reminding would change where I was. He said he was sorry for making me feel like I needed to send the message I had sent. He said he had thought he was being subtle. I said he had been. That was not a compliment. We did not exchange more messages after that, and I do not know what happened to Tobias in the months following. And I genuinely hope he is well. Not from residual warmth specifically, but from the general position that people who are unable to accept a concluded thing are usually people who are in some pain that the concluded thing is not actually the source of. The contact was about something other than me. I happened to be the person it was directed at. That's where that one lands. The 23 messages across 4 months laid out in sequence is the moment where the narrator's charitable reading collapses. Not because any individual message is damning, but because the sequence has a logic that the individual messages were designed to obscure. The message the narrator sends is the right move, made for the right reason. Not to punish Tobias, but to give him the explicit information that her continued warmth had not been providing, which was that the Tuesday was actually the conclusion. His response, confirming the framing, is both vindicating and sad in equal measure, and the narrator holds both. The final observation, that to the contact was about something other than her, is the most generous and probably most accurate reading, the one that removes Tobias from the category of bad actor and places him into the more human category of someone redirecting a pain they don't fully understand. Sometimes the cleanest ending you can make with someone is not clean enough for the person you made it with. And the most honest thing you can do is make it clean again, explicitly, a second time. Next up is someone who fell for a person who turned out to be a composite, assembled from the interests and qualities of the people who had come before, presented as an original and only legible as a composite once the narrator had enough information to see the seams. I have a specific set of interests that are uncommon enough that encountering them in someone else is statistically unusual. I say this not to establish myself as rare. I am not rare, I am simply specific. But because the specificity is relevant to the story. The interests in question are particular, a narrow genre of documentary filmmaking, a specific era of jazz that most jazz fans consider inaccessible, and a type of endurance sport that requires explanation at parties. I have spent years in relationships with people who tolerated these interests rather than shared them, which is fine, that is in most relationships, but the sharing of even one of them has always felt like a discovery. Her name was Margot, and she shared all three. I want to let that sit because I want you to understand what it meant to me before I tell you what it meant. We matched in October, and within the first week of messages, I knew she was different from the pattern I had described to myself. She knew the filmmakers I knew. She knew the era of jazz I knew. Not just its surface, but its specific interior. The debates between its practitioners. The recordings that most people would call difficult and that I would call essential. She had done the endurance sport and had opinions about it that were the opinions of someone who had gone deep rather than dabbled. I was, if I am being honest with myself, slightly overwhelmed by the recognition of it. The relationship that followed was genuinely good. The shared interests were not the only thing. They were the entry point into a person who had other qualities I valued. And the other qualities were real and distinct and hers. The 5 months were present and warm, and I did not have cause to examine them closely, because close examination requires a question, and I had no questions. The question arrived from an unexpected source in month 6. A man who had dated Margot before me. I had not known he existed, but he knew I existed, apparently. Reached out through a platform we were both on professionally. He said he had something to tell me that he had been deciding about for some time. He said he was not telling me to cause damage. He said he hoped I would take it in the spirit it was intended. He told me that when he had dated Margot, she had shared his interests completely. Not the same interests as mine. His interests, which were different from mine in every particular. A different genre of film, a different era of music, a different sport. He had found the overlap extraordinary and had built the early portion of their relationship around the shared foundation of it. At the end of their time together, he had discovered, through a conversation with a mutual friend, that the interests she had presented to him had not preceded him. They had been acquired in the period between her previous relationship and meeting him. He assembled from what she had learned about him before they met. I sat with what he told me, and I looked up who Margot had dated before him. The information was not hidden. She had mentioned a previous relationship in passing, and the person was findable through the ordinary connective tissue of social media. His interests were visible in his public presence. They were, as far as I could tell, his original interests. They were not my interests or the man who had contacted me. They were a third set, specific to a third person, visible in the public record of someone Margot had been with, before the man who had reached out to me. I looked at my own interests. I thought about when Margot and I had matched and what the timeline between her previous relationship and our matching would have allowed in terms of acquisition. The documentary filmmaking genre was findable through my professional presence. The jazz era was visible in things I had posted publicly. The endurance sport had been mentioned in an interview I had given that was accessible through a basic search. I had not been discovered. I had been researched and then mirrored. I talked to Margot. The conversation was one of the quieter, difficult ones I have had, because she did not deny what I was describing, and she was not defensive about it, and the absence of defensiveness made the thing harder to hold clearly. She said she had always found that the fastest way to genuine connection was shared enthusiasm, and that she did not always have the time to develop genuine enthusiasm organically, so she developed it deliberately. She said the enthusiasm became real in the process of developing it. She had genuinely come to love the filmmakers and the jazz and the sport, or she believed she had, and the belief was sincere. I asked her how she decided whose interests to acquire before a relationship. She said she paid attention to what people were interested in, and she prepared. I asked her if she thought the connections she made from that preparation were the same kind of connections she would have made if the overlap had been original. She was quiet for a long time and said she did not know. I ended things, not because the interests she had developed were not real. They may have been real. I cannot verify the interior experience of another person's enthusiasm, but because the foundation I had believed we were standing on had been constructed specifically to support my weight, and the construction had been done without my knowledge, and a foundation built for you without your knowledge is not the same as a foundation you built together, regardless of how solid it feels underfoot. The jazz still sounds the same. I have not been able to dislike it retroactively, which is a small mercy, but I hear it differently now. Not with someone else's ears, just with the awareness that my ears were the destination the music was traveling toward, before I had any idea the trip had started. That's the full picture. The three separate interest sets assembled for three separate people, each visible into the prior relationship's public record. I was the kind of evidence that closes off the alternative explanations without requiring a confrontation. The narrator does the work quietly, privately, before the conversation, and arrives at the conversation, already knowing rather than hoping to find out. Margot's lack of defensiveness being harder than defensiveness would have been, is the most counterintuitive and therefore most honest observation in the story. It is easier to be clear about someone who argues than someone who accepts the description and then asks you what the difference is between deliberate and genuine enthusiasm, because that question does not have a clean answer. The jazz sounding the same is the right ending image. The thing that was presented to draw them in is not ruined, it is just understood differently. The same sound carrying a different history. Sometimes the most disorienting thing about discovering you were researched before you were known is that the things the research assembled are not fake. They are just not the coincidence you thought they were. The next one is from someone who learned on the fifth date with a person they were genuinely excited about that the excitement had been operating on a significant piece of missing context. 5 dates over 3 weeks. Enough to have moved past the audition quality of very early dating. Enough to have developed a real sense of a person. Not enough to have the kind of established trust that makes significant disclosure feel safe rather than risky. That is the specific window the fifth date occupied, and it is relevant because the disclosure that happened on the fifth date would have been easier to receive on those on the first and harder to receive later, and I've spent some time thinking about whether the timing was calculated or simply human. His name was Raphael, and he was the kind of person who became more interesting the more time you spent with him, which is the direction you want things to go, and which is not as common as you would like. He was a pediatric nurse, which I mention because it shaped how he talked about things, with a specific matter-of-factness about human vulnerability that I found more appealing than performed toughness or performed softness. He was funny in the dry way. He remembered things. The 4 dates before the 5th had each been better than the one before it, and I had arrived at the 5th with a specific quality of excitement that comes from something that appears to be building towards something. On the 5th date, over dinner, Raphael told me he had a daughter. She was 4 years old. She lived with her mother, his ex, in a shared custody arrangement that involved her being with him every other week. He said he should have told me earlier, and he knew it, and he had not known how to introduce it in a way that did not make it the only thing a conversation could be about. And each date had felt like the wrong moment. And now it was the 5th date, and the wrong moment had become a different kind of wrong moment. I want to be accurate about my response, which was more complicated than I might have predicted before I was in it. I was not opposed to dating someone with a child. I had done it before. I had thought about it. I did not have the kind of categorical resistance to it that some people have. What I was responding to was the 5 dates during which I had been building a picture of a person without a significant piece of the picture, and the 5 dates worth of decisions I had made about how I felt and where I was going based on that incomplete picture. I asked him why, specifically, he had not told me sooner. He said 2 things. The first was that he had been burned by disclosing early, that he had told people on first and second dates and watched interest evaporate in real time in a way that was painful, and that he had learned to wait until there was enough connection to survive the information. The second was that he was aware the waiting had its own cost, and that he had been weighing those 2 costs against each other across the 4 dates, and had concluded, on the 5th, that he could not continue without saying it. I told him I understood the first reason, and I did. The asymmetry of early disclosure. where the information can end something before it has the foundation to survive the ending, is real, and it produces real incentive to wait. I also told him that the second cost was mine to bear rather than his to weigh on my behalf, and that the decision about how much connection I needed to have before receiving significant information about someone's life was not his to make for me. He said he understood that, and he said it without arguing and without defending further, which I found more honest than further argument would have been. I did not end things on the 5th date. We had a 6th and a 7th, and by the 8th date, I had met the context of his daughter in his life without meeting her. The schedule she created, the way he talked about her, the specific reorganization of a life around a 4-year-old that is visible in 1,000 small things before you ever meet the child. I found I could be inside that context. I found I wanted to. We are still together. The disclosure timing remains the thing I hold most carefully, not as a wound, but as information about how Raphael manages the gap between what he is carrying and when he shares it. The gap is real, and I have addressed it with him directly, which is to say, I have told him that in this relationship, the gap is going to be small, and he has said he can do that. And so far, he has. The daughter is 6 now. I have met her several times. She calls me by my first name in the specific, unself-conscious way of a child who has not yet learned to be awkward about the adults in her life. And I find that I love being called by my name in that specific way more than I expected to. And that's that. The two costs Raphael was weighing against each other. The cost of early disclosure versus the cost of delayed disclosure is real. And the narrator acknowledges both, rather than simply condemning the one that affected them, which is the kind of fairness that makes a narrator credible, from the observation that the second cost was the narrator's to bear, rather than Raphael's to weigh, is the most precise articulation of the problem. Not that he was wrong to be cautious, but that the caution was administered on someone else's behalf, without their participation. The daughter calling the narrator by their first name in the unself-conscious way of a child who hasn't learned awkwardness, yet is the ending image that earns the whole story. Small, specific, unexpectedly moving, the kind of detail that only appears in something real. Sometimes a disclosure that comes too late still comes early enough for the thing it lands in to survive it. And sometimes the thing it lands in is better for having been asked to hold something heavier than it knew it could. Here's one from someone who spent 10 months with a person who was, in by every measure, exactly who they said they were, and who still managed to conceal the one thing that changed everything. I want to establish clearly that Noah was not a liar. This is important because the story could be received as a story about a liar, and it is not. He was accurate in every particular I could verify. His job was what he said it was. His history was what he described. His feelings, which he expressed with a directness I found both appealing and occasionally startling, appeared to be genuine representations of his interior, rather than performances calibrated to produce an effect. He was a person of unusual consistency, the same in one-on-one conversation as in groups, the same when things were easy as when they were not, the same in month 10 as in month 1. And this consistency was one of the things I valued most about him, and I trusted it with the specific depth that consistency earns over time. The thing he concealed was a debt. Not a small one, a significant one, a number that I will not specify, but that would have been immediately relevant to the conversations we had been having about the future. We had been talking about the future and the specific way of people who have decided they are building one together. The kind of conversations that involve timelines and shared finances, and the ordinary practical architecture of two lives eventually combining. These conversations had been happening for 3 months at the back end of our 10 months, and he had been participating in them fully with apparent investment, without mentioning that his financial position was substantially different from the position he was implicitly describing. I found out from a document I was not supposed to see. not through snooping, a misfiled piece of mail that arrived at my address, the kind of administrative accident that happens when someone has recently changed addresses and the systems have not all caught up. I looked at it before understanding what it was and then continued looking because what it was had become relevant to me before I had fully registered that I should stop. I told him what I had seen. He was quiet for longer than I had learned to expect from him, and then he said he was sorry, and that he had been meaning to tell me, and had not found the right moment. I asked him how many of the future conversations had happened while he knew this. He said all of them. I asked him why. The why was the thing I could not assemble on my own because it did not fit the pattern of who he was. He was not evasive. He was not someone who managed information strategically. His consistency was the evidence of that. The concealment did not fit the person I had spent 10 months with, and I needed the gap explained. He said he had been ashamed, not of the debt itself, of how it had accumulated, which involved a period of his life he had referenced only obliquely during our 10 months, a period of poor decisions following a significant loss. He said the debt was the last visible remnant of that period, and the only thing he had not been able to put fully in the past because it existed in monthly statements that would not let him treat it as history. He said every time a future conversation happened, he had started to say something and had found the shame of the saying larger than the shame of the not saying, and had deferred again. I believed every word of this explanation. I also told him that the believing did not change what the deferring had produced, which was 3 months of future building on ground that was different from what I had understood, with decisions I had been approaching in the context of a picture that was missing a significant portion of itself. I had not been defrauded. I had been protected, his word, eventually, from something he had not been able to face in the context of a relationship he did not want to lose. The protection framing is the one I examined most carefully. There is a version of protection that involves withholding difficult information from someone because you believe them unable to handle it, which is condescending. There is a version that involves withholding difficult information because handling it together feels impossible, which is more human and more understandable, and still produces the same outcome for the person being protected. We did not end things over the debt. We ended things over what the 3 months of concurrent future building and concurrent concealment revealed about what he did when something felt impossible to say, which was that he continued the conversation without saying it, and the continuation was indistinguishable from the conversation without the concealment. And I could not build a future with someone whose response to an impossible thing was to be present and warm and consistent, while the impossible thing waited in silence for a moment that never arrived. He understood. He said so, and I believed him. And believing him did not make it easier, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about how it ended. There it is. The debt, as the last visible remnant of a period he had otherwise put in the past, is the most compassionate framing of the concealment available, and the narrator gives it full credit before explaining why full credit is still insufficient. The distinction between two versions of protection, condescension versus the more human impossibility of saying something in the context of something you cannot afford to lose, is the most precise thinking in the story. And the narrator does it publicly rather than landing on a simpler verdict that would be easier to hold. The ending reason, not the debt but the concurrent concealment alongside full participation in future conversations, is the right reason, identified correctly as the thing that reveals something about his behavior under pressure that the 10 months of consistency had not revealed because nothing that felt impossible had arisen before. Sometimes you can be entirely who you say you are and still conceal the one thing that would have changed how everything else was understood. And sometimes the one thing is not the thing itself, but what its concealment shows you about the person who kept it. This one is from someone who spent 7 months with a person who was, by every visible measure, and I'm fully present, and discovered at the end that the presence had been a form of practice for something they were not part of. I want to be precise about what I mean by practice, because I do not mean it cynically. I mean it in the way that some people use relationships to become the person they want to be in a relationship, and the becoming happens at the cost of the person they are becoming with, who does not know they are a site of transformation rather than a destination. His name was Adrian, and he came to me 8 months out of a long relationship that had, by his account, required him to be smaller than he was. He had spent 4 years in something that asked him to manage his intensity down, his enthusiasm down, his fundamental quality of being a lot, which he was, and in which I found appealing rather than exhausting, down to a level that did not overwhelm his former partner. He had done this for 4 years, and the doing of it had cost him something. He was still in the process of recovering when we met. The recovery, in the 7 months we were together, was visible and ongoing. He was learning to take up the space he had spent 4 years vacating. He was learning to say what he wanted without apologizing for wanting it. He was learning to be present without monitoring his own presence for excess. I watched this and I participated in it in the way that a relationship participates in a person's growth. As context, as witness, as the place where the new behaviors get practiced, because the relationship is safe enough to practice in. I did not understand, while I was participating, that I was primarily a context rather than a destination. The ending came from him. Month 7, an evening that had been ordinary until it wasn't. A conversation he initiated with the specific quality of something that had been decided before it was said. He told me he had realized something in the previous weeks. He said the relationship had given him something he had needed. He was careful and specific about what that something was, which I appreciated even in the moment, and that what he had needed and what was available to grow into next were different things and probably required different people. He said he was not leaving for someone else. He was leaving because he had become, in the 7 months with me, someone who knew what he wanted, and what he wanted was not something our relationship was structured to provide. I asked him what our relationship was structured to provide that he was now outgrowing. He was honest in the way of someone who has rehearsed a difficult thing and has arrived at the version that is true, rather than the version that is kind. He said our relationship had been structured to receive him as he was rebuilding, that it was generous and safe, and that the generosity and safety had been what he needed, and that what he needed next required less safety and more, he searched for the word, more aliveness. I sat with that word for a long time, more aliveness. He was telling me that the relationship was safe in a way that had become a ceiling rather than a floor. That the thing that had allowed him to heal had also limited what he could grow toward. And that the limit was mine, not a failure, not a flaw, but a structural feature of what we were together that he had used well and was done using. I did not argue, not because I did not want to, but because the argument was not available to me. He was describing something about us that I recognized as I heard it, something I had registered without naming. The specific quality of a relationship where one person is growing and the other is holding the space for the growing. I had been the space. I had not known I was primarily the space. The weeks after the ending were the ones I found hardest, not because I was devastated, I was not, or not entirely, but because of the specific quality of what I was sitting with. I had been a place where someone became who they were going to be and then left to be it somewhere else. And the leaving was the proof that the becoming had worked. And the proof of the becoming was the evidence of my own obsolescence. I had done something right that produced my own replacement. I have thought about this often enough that I have stopped thinking about it as a wound and started thinking about it as a question about what I bring to relationships and whether what I bring is the kind of thing that holds or the kind of thing that launches, and whether those two things are as different as they sound, or whether the best relationships are both at once. I do not have an answer. I am still working out what the question even is. Adrian sent a message 6 months after we ended, not asking for anything, just a message that said he was doing well and that what we had was something he thought about with gratitude rather than complicated feelings. I read it and I believed it, and I wrote back something brief that was true, that I was glad for the 7 months, and that I hoped what he had built in them held. I meant both things fully. That is either evidence of emotional health or evidence of something I have not finished processing. I have not decided which. That's where that one ends. The word aliveness is the one that lands and stays, not because it is cruel, but because it is accurate in a way that accurate things sometimes are, when they are also the last thing you wanted to hear. The narrator's recognition of what Adrian was describing as something they had already half noticed without naming is the most honest moment in the story. The retroactive clarity that comes when someone finally says the true thing about a dynamic you have been inside and could feel but could not see from where you were standing. The question at the end, whether what they bring to relationships launches or holds, and whether those are as different as they sound, is the right question to be left with, open and unresolved, because it is genuinely open and genuinely unresolved, and pretending otherwise would be a smaller ending than the story deserves. Sometimes the most honest thing a relationship can tell you is something about the specific shape of what you offer, and sometimes that information is more useful than the relationship that delivered it. Our final story tonight comes from someone who spent 2 years trying to understand why the best relationship of their life had ended, and found the answer in the last place they expected: a conversation with themselves. I want to tell this one differently from the others because it is different from the others. There is no revelation from outside, no stranger at a bus stop, no forwarded screenshot, no message from someone who knew something they didn't. The discovery in this one came from the inside, and it came slowly. And it is not entirely comfortable to tell even now, which is probably why I'm telling it. I dated a woman named Simone for 2 years. The 2 years were the best I had been in. Not because they were without difficulty. They were not. But because the difficulty was the kind that two people work through together, rather than the kind that accumulates in the space between them. We were good at the hard parts. We were good at the ordinary parts. We were good in the way that you know while you're in it, not just in retrospect. Which is rare enough that I recognized it and told her I recognized it, and she said she did too. She ended it. I did not see it coming with the clarity that I think I should have seen it coming. And the not seeing was part of what I spent the following 2 years trying to understand. I had been in something I believed was mutual and forward moving, and then it had ended, and the ending had not felt like the ending of something mutual and forward moving. It felt like the ending of something that had been different from what I believed it was, and the difference was somewhere I could not locate. I talked to her about it in the weeks after. She was kind and honest and specific about what she had experienced and what had led her to the decision. And I received everything she said and tried to integrate it, and found that it did not fully account for the gap I was feeling between what I had believed we were in and what the ending suggested we had been in. The gap persisted through months of examination, and I could not close it. What I found eventually was that the gap was not in Simone's account of her experience. Her account was accurate as far as it went. The gap was in my account of my own. I had been so certain of what we were, so confident in the reading I had made of the relationship, that I had stopped asking whether my reading was the complete one. I had stopped asking Simone how she was in the relationship. I had assumed I knew, because things felt good to me, because the evidence available to me was positive, because I had been inside something that felt mutual, and I had let the feeling of mutuality substitute for the ongoing practice of checking whether the mutuality was still what I thought it was. She had been, in the final months, in a different place than I had understood. not hiding it or not intentionally, but also not saying it with the directness that would have made it visible to someone who had stopped asking. I had stopped asking because I had been certain. The certainty had been comfortable, and the comfort had been the thing that prevented me from noticing what was happening in the place I was not looking. This is not a story about what Simone did. She ended a relationship she had reasons to end, and she did it honestly and with care. This is a story about what I did, which was to stop being curious about the interior of someone I loved because I believed I already knew it, and to let the belief substitute for the practice, and to discover at the end that the practice was the thing that would have told me what I needed to know. I am a better partner now than I was during those 2 years, not in the ways that are visible from outside. I was attentive and present and generous in the ways that are visible. In the way that is not visible, which is the ongoing and effortful and never finished work of actually asking rather than assuming, of treating the interior of another person as something that changes and requires continuous attention rather than something you can know once and reference, of staying curious about someone, even when, especially when, you are certain you already know them. The relationship with Simone ended 2 years ago. I have not replaced it with something equivalent, and I'm not sure I expected to. What I have done with the 2 years is try to understand what I was doing inside it well enough to do something different in the next one. The understanding is not complete. I do not think it becomes complete. I think it continues for as long as you are willing to keep looking at it, and I'm still willing. She is doing well. I know this through the ordinary social ambient information, and I'm glad for it without complication. She deserved the relationship to end if it was not working for her, and she deserved what came after it to be good. Both of those things are true, and I hold them, without the residue of resentment that I might have held earlier, which I take as evidence that the 2 years of looking has produced something, even if what it has produced is not fully visible yet. That story is over. The gap between what I believed we were in and what the ending suggested we had been in being located, not in her account, but in his own, is the move that makes this the right story to end on, because it asks the hardest question any of these stories can ask. Yeah, which is not what someone else concealed or misrepresented, but what you stopped looking for, because you were comfortable enough not to look. The certainty being the thing that prevented the noticing is not a comfortable conclusion, and the narrator does not dress it as one. The practice of staying curious about someone even when you believe you know them is not a lesson that arrives cleanly. It arrives as the answer to a question that costs 2 years to locate, and the willingness to keep looking at it, even when the looking is not complete, is the only honest place any of these stories can end. And that is what I keep thinking about as I get to the end of tonight's stories. Every single one of them, every person we heard from, was trying to do the same thing. They were trying to know someone, to be known in return, to build something real with another person, in a world where real is harder to establish than it looks and easier to lose than you expect, and almost always worth attempting anyway. Some of them were lied to directly. Some of them were managed carefully. Some of them misread something. Some of them stopped asking too soon, or trusted too completely, or found out too late, or found out from a stranger at a bus stop when they were just trying to get home on a Tuesday. Most of them ended up with something they hadn't planned for, an understanding of themselves or of another person, or of the specific shape of what they were willing to offer and what they needed in return. Some of them found people they stayed with. Some of them found the thing you can only find after something ends. None of them stopped trying. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Every single person who sat down to tell one of these stories tonight is someone who, after everything, was still willing to be in it. Still willing to show up to the first date, to the fifth date, to the conversation that changed everything, to the coffee shop on the Tuesday. Still willing to be known. That kind of willingness is not nothing. It is, if I'm honest, everything. Get some rest. If something tonight felt less like a story and more like a Tuesday you lived through, I hope it helped to hear it out loud. I'll be back with more. You know where to find me.